Hey, welcome back, friend. Or maybe this is your very first time here, and if it is, I am so glad you found your way. Either way, settle in, get comfortable, pull that blanket a little closer. Because tonight we are going somewhere you have probably never imagined going, and honestly, once I tell you where, you might be glad you can only visit in your mind. Here is something I need you to think about for just a moment. Imagine waking up tomorrow morning and the smell of coffee does not greet you. Instead, what hits you first is your neighbour's open sewer, then the tannery 2 streets down, then the pile of animal waste that has been sitting outside your door since Tuesday. And here is the wild part: you do not even flinch, because to you this is just Tuesday. That is the world most human beings lived in for the vast majority of recorded history. A world where smell was not something you could escape. It was not something you complained about to the landlord. It was simply the air. And tonight we're going to talk about what that actually meant. The smells, the bugs, the noise, the darkness, the cold, the things that crept into your food, your bed, your skin, the 1,000 small annoyances that people before us simply had to endure. And I promise you, by the time we are done, the next time your Wi-Fi is slow or your coffee order comes out wrong, you will feel a very specific kind of gratitude. Before we go any further, if you enjoy falling asleep to stories like this, ones that take you somewhere real and strange and unexpected, please take a moment to subscribe and leave a like. It means more than you know. And I would genuinely love to know, where are you listening from right now? Are you in bed, the fan going softly, stretched out on the couch? Maybe you just got back from a long day and this is the first quiet moment you've had. Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. Now dim the lights if you can, let the room get soft, and let us begin. Let us start at the very beginning of the problem, with smell. Because out of all the daily discomforts people endured before modern life, smell is perhaps the one that is hardest for us to truly imagine. We are so used to living in a world of deodorant, soap, sewage systems and refrigerators that the idea of stepping outside and being hit by a wall of odour every single day without relief, without exception, feels almost fictional. But it was not fictional. It was just life. Picture yourself in Paris, not the Paris of today with its wide boulevards and croissants and little cafes with red awnings. I mean Paris in the 17th century, a city of roughly 500,000 people, which made it one of the largest cities in the world at the time. And here is what the French historian Henri Sauval wrote about it. He lived from 1623 to 1676. He described Paris as, and I will keep his meaning here, a city black and foul-smelling, its stench so unbearable to anyone arriving from outside that it could be detected from 3 or 4 leagues away. That is roughly 10 to 15 miles. You could smell Paris before you could see it. Let that sink in. 10 to 15 miles out, travelling along a dusty road, and the city would announce itself not with church bells, not with the sight of rooftops, but with its odour drifting toward you on the breeze like an uninvited guest. Now you might be wondering what exactly was creating this smell, and the honest answer is almost everything. Because in a city without modern sanitation, every single human activity produces waste. And in the 17th, 18th, even early 19th century, there was nowhere for that waste to go except out. Out the window, into the street, into the river. The most common practice in medieval and early modern European cities was what historians sometimes call the garder l'eau system, a phrase borrowed from the French meaning watch out for the water. In practice, it meant that when you were done with whatever was in your chamber pot, you opened the window and you threw it into the street below. Sometimes, if you were polite, you shouted a warning first. Often you did not. And so the streets of cities like Paris, London, Edinburgh, cities we think of today as the centres of civilization and culture, were quite literally running with human waste. Not occasionally, not in the poor parts of town, everywhere. But it was not just the people. Think about the animals. In a world before cars, horses were the engine of civilization. They pulled carts, they carried soldiers, they transported goods from city to city. And in the 19th century, at the height of the horse-drawn era, London alone had somewhere between 50,000 and 300,000 working horses inside the city at any given time. Each horse produces roughly 15 to 30 pounds of manure every single day. You can do that math yourself. And all of it landed in the streets. Workers called crossing sweepers. Many of them children made their living clearing a path through the manure so that pedestrians could cross without ruining their shoes. It was considered a respectable job, a necessary job, because the alternative was simply wading through it. And then there were the industries. A medieval or early modern city was not just where people lived, it was where people worked. And the trades of that era were, by our standards, almost impossibly pungent. Tanneries turned animal hides into leather, and to do this they soaked the skins in enormous vats filled with a mixture that included urine often collected from humans, chicken droppings, dog excrement, and a chemical called alum. This process was effective. It was also deeply aggressively, almost personally offensive to the nose. Butchers slaughtered animals in the open, and the blood and offal ran into the streets. Fishmongers kept their wares in the heat of the day. Fullers who processed wool used fermented urine as a cleaning agent. Dyers who coloured cloth worked with chemicals that produced fumes sharp enough to make your eyes water from across the street. The historian Robert Mushemblid, in his remarkable study of smell in early modern Europe, described the cities of this era as places where the noisy, dirty, crowded streets were home to more and more polluting trades well before the Industrial Revolution. This was not a temporary problem. It was not a bad month or a rough season. This was simply how cities smelled for centuries. Now here is where the story gets genuinely fascinating and a little bit surreal. Because people in these cities were not simply suffering and complaining. They were developing an entire philosophy around smell, a logic, a system of belief about odour that from our modern perspective is equal parts brilliant and terrifying. The dominant medical theory of the time, held not by superstitious country folk, but by trained physicians at respected universities, was called the miasma theory. The word miasma comes from Greek meaning pollution or bad air, and the idea was elegantly simple. Disease does not come from bacteria. Disease does not come from contaminated water. Disease comes from bad smells. If the air smells terrible, the air is dangerous. And if you breathe enough of it, you will get sick. This was not a fringe idea. This was the mainstream scientific consensus for roughly 2,000 years, from ancient Greece all the way to the mid-19th century. It influenced city planning, hospital design, burial practices, and everyday personal behaviour. And in a strange backwards way, it was not entirely wrong. Bad smells and disease really did tend to appear together. They just did not understand why. The smell was a symptom of the same conditions that created the disease, the contaminated water, the rotting waste, the overcrowding, not the cause itself. But that distinction was invisible to them, and so the response to disease was often make the smell go away. This led to some coping strategies that are, depending on your perspective, either creative or completely alarming. Wealthy people carried small glass or silver containers filled with herbs and spices called pomanders, which they held to their nose when walking through particularly fragrant sections of the city. The word pomander comes from the French for apple of amber, because the original versions were balls of ambergris, a waxy substance produced in the digestive tract of sperm whales mixed with spices. And ambergris, for those who have not encountered it, smells surprisingly pleasant, like the sea and something sweet and something ancient. So the image of a wealthy 17th century gentleman walking through the filth of a Paris street clutching a ball of whale intestinal wax to his nose is both absurd and in its way kind of poetic. Flowers were pressed to faces. Perfumes were layered on thick, not to smell beautiful, but to create a kind of olfactory armor against the world outside. And in extreme cases, some physicians recommended that the best defense against a particularly foul miasma was to inhale an even fouler smell, on the theory that the bad smell would fight off the worse smell. A German doctor writing in 1680 was still recommending that patients go to their outdoor privy first thing in the morning and breathe in deeply, on an empty stomach, for their health. But of all the moments in history that capture just how bad the smell problem could get, nothing compares to the summer of 1858 in London. And this story, I think, deserves to be told slowly, because it is almost unbelievable. By 1858, London was the largest city in the world. Over 2.5 million people lived there. Queen Victoria was on the throne. The British Empire stretched across a quarter of the globe. This was by almost every measure the most powerful and sophisticated city on earth, and it smelled absolutely catastrophically, magnificently terrible. The problem had been building for decades. London's population had doubled since the early part of the 19th century. There were at one point an estimated 200,000 cesspools beneath the city's streets, essentially large pits dug into the ground where household waste collected. These pits were supposed to be emptied regularly by workers called night soil men, who came after dark, collected the waste in carts and sold it as fertilizer for farmland outside the city. It was in its way a remarkably sensible system. It was also deeply inadequate for a city growing as fast as London was. Cesspools overflowed, sewers backed up, and when the relatively new technology of the flushing toilet began spreading through the city, it made things dramatically worse because it moved waste from private homes directly into the old drainage system, which then discharged everything directly into the River Thames, the river that also supplied London's drinking water. By the summer of 1858, the Thames had been absorbing the waste of 2.5 million people for years, and then came the heat. That June temperatures in London climbed to 35 degrees Celsius, which for a city that was not built for heat, and where most people had no way to cool themselves, was already miserable. But the heat did something else too. It accelerated the decomposition of everything sitting in and along the Thames. Gases rose from the riverbed. Waste that had been merely unpleasant became genuinely overpowering, and the smell drifted everywhere, into the streets, into the houses, into the offices, into Parliament itself. The Houses of Parliament sit right on the bank of the Thames, and that summer the smell was so severe that members of Parliament soaked their curtains in lime chloride, a disinfectant with its own sharp chemical smell, and hung them over the windows just to be able to breathe. Benjamin Disraeli, who was then the Chancellor of the Exchequer, a position roughly equivalent to the head of the Treasury, was seen fleeing the library with a handkerchief pressed firmly over his face. Parliamentary debate ground to a halt. Attendance dropped. There was genuine discussion about simply moving Parliament to another city entirely. Queen Victoria and Prince Albert attempted to take a pleasure cruise on the Thames that summer and turned back within minutes because the smell was too much to bear. Newspapers called the summer the Great Stink. One London publication described the river as a festering and reeking abomination, a stream of death. Residents of the city sold scented handkerchiefs on the streets. People vomited from the stench near the riverbank. Workers dumped over 200 tons of lime directly into the river in a desperate attempt to neutralize the smell. It did not work, but here is the part of this story that I love most, because it is not just a story about suffering. It is a story about what happens when things get so bad that people are finally absolutely forced to act. Before the Great Stink, the city had been arguing about its sewage problem for years. Engineers had drawn up plans. Scientists had published reports. Proposals had been reviewed, revised, and quietly shelved. No one wanted to pay for it. No one wanted to disrupt the streets. No one wanted to deal with it. But that summer the smell was so impossible, so inescapable, so utterly undeniable that Parliament passed emergency funding within 18 days. 18 days! Something that had been stuck in bureaucratic limbo for decades was resolved in under 3 weeks, because the politicians literally could not breathe. The engineer Joseph Basil Gett was given authorization to build an entirely new sewer system for London. He designed it to be massive, over 1,100 miles of street sewers, feeding into 85 miles of main intercepting sewers running alongside the Thames. He used 318 million bricks. He designed the system to handle twice London's population at the time, anticipating future growth. And here is the astonishing thing: the sewers Basil Gett built in the 1860s still form the backbone of London's drainage system today. Over 150 years later, this one incredible stinking Parliament-stopping crisis produced infrastructure that an entire city still relies on every single morning. And that, I think, is what makes the history of smell so fascinating. It is not just a story about how bad things were. It is a story about how people adapted, endured, improvised, and eventually solved. They did not have the luxury of closing a window and turning on the air conditioning. They could not order a scented candle online. The smell was simply there, every morning, every evening, every breath, and they kept going. They worked, loved, raised children, wrote poetry, built cathedrals, and navigated a world that smelled by our standards absolutely extraordinary. And here is the thought I want to leave you with before we move on. The next time you step outside after rain, that clean, earthy, slightly electric smell that rises from the pavement, take 1 extra second with it. That smell has been there since the beginning of time. But the cleanness of it, the ability to smell the rain rather than everything else that is relatively new, that is something that people fought for, sometimes quite literally with their lungs and their noses and their political institutions. That clean air, it cost centuries of discomfort to earn. And speaking of discomfort, smell was really just the opening act. Because living in the world before modern conveniences meant that the smell had company. It brought along some very persistent, very unwelcome house guests. The kind that move in, make themselves at home, and absolutely refuse to leave. Up next, we're going inside the walls, under the floorboards, and yes, into the very bed where our ancestors tried to sleep, to meet the creatures that shared every space, every meal, and every quiet moment with them. And I promise you, you will never look at your mattress quite the same way again. So you have probably at some point in your life had a moment with a bug. Maybe a cockroach appeared in your kitchen at 2 a.m. Maybe you found a mouse had gotten into your pantry. Maybe you spotted something crawling across your ceiling that you definitely did not invite in. And your reaction, if you are anything like most people, was probably not calm. There was a shriek, or at least a sharp intake of breath. You grabbed a shoe, a broom, something. You sealed every crack you could find. You may have slept a little less soundly that night, and here is the thing I want you to sit with for just a moment. That reaction, that full-body instinctive immediate revulsion, is actually a very new luxury. Because for most of human history, the cockroach in your kitchen was not an emergency. It was just Tuesday again. Let us go back to the year 1607. 104 English settlers have just arrived on the shores of what is now Virginia, and they are establishing the colony of Jamestown, the first permanent English settlement in North America. They are cold. They are hungry. The water is brackish and barely drinkable. They are surrounded by a landscape they do not understand, with dangers they cannot yet name. And then on top of all of that, Captain John Smith opens the food store. What he finds inside he describes in his journal with a kind of exhausted resignation that you can almost feel through the page. He writes that the provisions contained as many worms as grains. The colony's food supply, their entire reserve, The thing that stood between 100 people and starvation. Worms. A year later, he writes again about the same problem, noting that the remaining stores were so rotten with worms as the hogs would scarcely eat it. The hogs would scarcely eat it. That was the soldiers' dinner. Now, the fascinating thing about Jamestown is not just that this happened once. It is that it happened again and again, and historians can trace exactly how. When archaeologists excavated one of Jamestown's original wells, between 2005 and 2006, they found preserved in the soil of a rubbish dump that had once been a water source the remains of more than 24 different species of insects. All European, all stowaways. They had crossed the Atlantic Ocean tucked inside the colony's own food stores and timber, clinging to the underside of civilization as it made its way into the New World. There were saw-toothed grain beetles, tiny determined creatures that bored into any stored cereal they could find. There were Trox scaber beetles which fed on discarded scraps. There were rove beetles drawn to the mouldy wood of the new construction. These insects did not choose to come to America. They simply went wherever the food went, and the food went to Jamestown. But here is where the story takes a genuinely strange turn. Because the cockroach that most despised of household insects, the one that has become almost a symbol of infestation, was not even native to the Americas. The American cockroach, despite its name, is originally from Africa. It arrived on the continent in the 17th century, carried aboard the same trade ships that were crossing the Atlantic in enormous numbers, and when it arrived, people immediately knew they had a problem. Captain John Smith himself complained about an insect that Spanish explorers had named the cucaracha, writing that it would eat and defile with their ill-scented dung. An English doctor named Thomas Mouffet, writing in 1658, called cockroaches, though he mistakenly identified them as moths, nasty, cruel, rough, and thieving. You have to love the thieving part, as if the man was personally offended, as if the cockroach had taken something that belonged to him, and in a way it had. It was taking his food, his peace of mind, and his sense that his home was his own, which it turned out it very much was not. Have you ever stopped to wonder why the phrase "sleep tight, don't let the bedbugs bite" became a common saying? Not just a clever rhyme, not just a quaint old expression, an actual practical warning. Because bedbugs were not for most of human history an occasional nuisance to be dealt with by calling a professional. They were a constant nightly companion. Warm homes attracted them. Wooden bed frames harboured their eggs in every crack and joint. Straw mattresses were essentially perfect bedbug apartments, soft, warm, full of small spaces to hide, and replaced infrequently enough that generations of insects could comfortably set up residence. And unlike the cockroach, which at least had the decency to mostly come out at night and stay in the kitchen, the bedbug was in your most intimate space, in your bed, on your body, while you slept. Medieval households had a specific set of strategies for managing this, and I use the word managing very deliberately, because elimination was not really on the table. One 14th century household manual, written supposedly by a husband, advising his much younger wife on how to run a proper home, includes among its practical tips detailed instructions for dealing with fleas. His suggestions include scatter alder leaves around the floor of the room, use white bedsheets because fleas are easier to spot and catch on white fabric, and most creatively place a slice of bread coated in glue in the centre of the bed with a candle burning in the middle. The idea was that the heat and light of the candle would attract the fleas. They would hop toward it, land on the sticky bread and become stuck. A flea trap, made of bread, with a candle, in your bed. I want to be very clear that this was considered practical, sensible household advice. This was the medieval equivalent of calling an exterminator. And while we are talking about the things that shared people's beds, we should talk about lice. because lice are one of those subjects that people today regard with a particular mix of horror and embarrassment, the kind of thing that is whispered about at school nurse offices and treated with specialized shampoo as quickly as possible. But in the medieval and early modern world, lice were simply part of life, not just for the poor, not just for the unwashed, for everyone, for kings, for bishops, for wealthy merchants, for scholars. The scholar and religious writer Pope Innocent III, writing in the 13th century, included a meditation on lice in a serious theological work, noting that in life a person produced lice and tapeworms, and that after death they would continue to serve as food for worms and flies. This was not meant as an insult. It was meant as a philosophical observation about the nature of the human body. The lice were simply assumed to be there. An Irish clergyman visiting Iceland in 825, that is the 9th century, marvelled at Iceland's long summer days, and noted that the light was bright enough that, whatever task a man wishes to perform, even picking lice from his shirt he can manage as well as in clear daylight. Picking lice from his shirt, mentioned casually as one of many tasks a man might need to perform in decent light, like reading or writing or picking lice from his shirt. In the mountain village of Montelieu in southern France, when the Inquisition came in the early 14th century, and investigators recorded testimony from dozens of local residents about their daily lives, the records are peppered with references to delousing. The village priest was regularly deloused by his mistresses. Women gathered on their rooftops in the sun to delouse each other's hair. It was a social activity, something you did with the people you were close to. The intimacy of it was real. Being willing to pick through someone's hair for lice was an act of trust, of closeness, of care. It is not so different when you think about it from how other primates groom each other. We just find it a great deal more disturbing. Now here is a question I genuinely want to pose to you. Do you think if you had been born into this world you would have handled it differently? Or do you think after a few weeks, a few months, a few years of this being simply the texture of life, you would have simply stopped noticing? Because that is exactly what the historical evidence suggests happened. People adapted, not because they were tougher than us or less sensitive, but because adaptation is what humans do when they have no other choice. The lice were simply there, the rats were simply there, the fleas were simply there, and life went on. The rats deserve their own moment here because the story of rats and human civilization is long, complicated, and honestly a little bit humbling. Rats did not just coexist with people, they thrived alongside us. They followed trade routes stowing away on ships. They nested in granaries in walls beneath floors. They ate what we ate. They lived where we lived. And for most of history, the attempts to control them range from practical to deeply, wonderfully strange. In medieval Europe, there are documented cases of communities trying to address their rat problems through legal proceedings. Not traps, not poison, lawsuits. There are historical records of rats and other pests being formally summoned to appear before ecclesiastical courts, church courts, and being sentenced in absentia, obviously, to leave the premises. One of the most famous cases involved a lawyer named Bartholomew Chassenet, who in the early 16th century was called upon to defend a group of rats that had been accused of destroying a barley harvest in Burgundy, France. He argued with apparent seriousness that his clients could not appear in court because the journey was too dangerous. There were too many cats between their homes and the courthouse. The court apparently accepted this argument. The rats were granted more time. The barley presumably did not recover, but alongside the absurd there was real ingenuity. The ancient Romans built their first rat-proof granary in 13 before the Common Era, a remarkable engineering achievement credited to an architect named Marcus Pollio, who designed it with walls and foundations that made it genuinely difficult for rodents to enter. In China, as early as 324 of the Common Era farmers were introducing specific species of predatory ants into their orchards to manage insect pests, essentially inventing the concept of biological pest control almost 2,000 years before it became a mainstream agricultural technique. And in the American colonies, where the pest problem was particularly acute because all of it was new, the insects, the rodents, the unfamiliar diseases they carried, farmers developed an extraordinary variety of folk remedies, some clever, some useless, some accidentally effective. Hang a hornet's nest in your kitchen to keep flies away. Nail a toad to the door of your granary to repel weevils, a suggestion that goes back at least to the Roman writer Pliny the Elder in the 1st century of the Common Era, which tells you something about how persistent the problem was. Place sheepskins in the grain storage because the smell apparently discouraged weevils. Plant a border of white mustard around your tobacco seedlings because tobacco flies preferred mustard to young plants. Some of these worked, most did not, but all of them speak to the same underlying reality that people were genuinely, constantly, daily contending with creatures that wanted what they had and were spectacularly good at getting it, and perhaps no story captures this tension quite like the rat hunters of Hanoi. In the late 19th century, French colonial administrators decided to modernize the city of Hanoi by building a new sewer system, proper underground infrastructure, the kind of thing that was transforming European cities at the time. It was by the standards of the era a genuinely forward-thinking project. There was just one problem. The new sewers created a perfect environment for rats, warm, dark, interconnected, full of organic material. Within a short time, the rat population had exploded to the point where it was becoming a genuine public health concern. So the colonial government launched what seemed like a sensible solution. They would pay rat hunters for every rat they caught, as proof of the kill hunters needed to bring in a rat tail. At its peak, the rat-catching program was processing over 4,000 rat tails per day. On one particularly productive day, over 20,000 tails were turned in, which sounds like a success, until someone noticed that the rat population was not actually declining. A closer investigation revealed why. The hunters had figured out that a rat with its tail cut off can still survive, still breed, and still produce more rats, more tails. So rather than killing the rats and bringing in their bodies, many hunters were simply catching rats, cutting off their tails, and releasing them back into the sewers, where they would then go on to have more rats, more tails, more money. The program was supposed to eliminate the problem. Instead, it was accidentally subsidizing it. The French colonial authorities eventually cancelled the tail bounty, and the rats carried on with their lives indifferent as ever. There is something in all of this that I find genuinely moving in a strange way. Not the suffering, not the discomfort, not the bread and candle flea traps or the lice-picking rooftop gatherings or the worm-infested soldiers' rations, but the persistence, the sheer stubborn human insistence on continuing, on building granaries even when rats would always find a way in, on making beds even when fleas would find a way into them, on planting crops even when insects would find a way to consume them. The people who lived through all of this did not think of themselves as suffering. They thought of themselves as living, and they were right. Think about that the next time you seal a crack in your window, or lay a mousetrap with a little piece of cheese, or feel that flash of indignation when you find something has gotten into your kitchen and helped itself. That impulse, the irritation, the determination to fix it, the refusal to simply accept it as the cost of being alive that is ancient. That is one of the most continuous human reactions across thousands of years. The bugs were there first. We have just been slowly, stubbornly, generation by generation reclaiming our space. And speaking of reclaiming space, the next thing people wanted to reclaim was their sleep. Not from bugs, not from rats, but from something older and stranger, from the darkness itself. and from the astonishing number of ways that the night before, electricity was not a time of rest. It was something people had to actively survive. What that looked like, and what it reveals about the way our ancestors experienced something as simple as going to bed, is a story that I think will genuinely surprise you. After everything we have just explored, the creatures that shared every space, the infestations in the food stores, the flea traps made of bread and candle, you might assume that the worst of pre-industrial life was the smell and the insects. But there was another dimension to daily annoyance running underneath all of it. Constant, unrelenting, and entirely impossible to escape. Not anything dangerous, not anything that would harm you. Just sound. An almost continuous wall of it from before dawn until well past dark. And the fascinating thing is that the noise problem is not new. It is ancient. So ancient, in fact, that one of the first things Julius Caesar did when he consolidated power in Rome was to write a law about it. Picture the city of Rome in 44 before the Common Era. 1 million people. Narrow streets, many of them barely wide enough for 2 people to pass each other comfortably. And through these streets all day long rolled the wagons. Hundreds of wagons, loaded with grain and building materials and wine and everything a city of 1 million people required to function. The wheels were wooden, the rims were iron, the streets were stone, and the sound of iron on stone wagon after wagon clattering through narrow urban canyons from sunrise to sunset was so relentless, so disruptive, so completely incompatible with daily life, that Julius Caesar, shortly before his death, issued what historians now recognize as the first noise ordinance in recorded human history. The decree was specific. No one shall drive a wagon along the streets of Rome after sunrise or before the 10th hour of the night. Daytime was for pedestrians. Wheeled traffic had to wait until dark. Problem solved. Except it was not solved at all. Because banning wagons during the day meant that every delivery Rome needed, every shipment of grain, every barrel of wine, every load of building materials arrived after dark. All at once, through the same narrow streets, making the same iron-on-stone racket, just between midnight and dawn instead of noon and dusk. The Roman poet Juvenal, writing in the late 1st century of the Common Era, describes it with a vivid exhaustion that sounds almost contemporary. He writes that the passing of wagons through the narrow twisting streets and the cursing of drivers caught in nighttime traffic jams would rouse a sleeping seal from its slumber, or even an emperor. He concludes with the weary precision of a man who has given up on sleep entirely that insomnia was causing most deaths in the city. He meant it only partly as a joke. What I find genuinely remarkable about this story is not the noise itself. It is the futility of the solution. Julius Caesar, one of the most powerful individuals who ever lived, a man who reorganized the Roman calendar, conquered Gaul, and reshaped the entire structure of Roman governance, tried to fix a noise problem. He wrote a law. He specified the hours. He had the full authority of the Roman state behind him. And the noise continued, because the noise was not a product of anyone's carelessness or negligence. It was the product of the city itself, of 1 million people living in close proximity, all of them needing things, all of them moving things, all of them existing, simultaneously in the same dense, echoing space. There was no solution. There was only the management of when the noise happened, which, as Juvenal's Insomnia would suggest, was not much of an improvement. Jump forward about 1,000 years to a medieval European city. The noise had not been solved, it had simply changed its character, and the sound that defined the medieval soundscape above all others was something that to modern ears sounds almost romantic. Church bells. Medieval cities ran on bells. Not in the casual occasional sense that we experience bells today, the rare Sunday peal, the clock tower marking a special occasion. Bells were the infrastructure of time itself, Every church in a medieval city had its own bell tower, each ringing at its own intervals for its own purposes. Bells announced the beginning and end of the working day. Bells called people to prayer not once or twice, but multiple times every single day from matins before dawn to compline after dark. Bells warned of fire. Bells announced market openings. Bells tolled for the dead. Bells marked the opening and closing of city gates. In Florence, historians have found evidence that the various churches actually coordinated their bell ringing to create a deliberate daily sonic pattern, a kind of acoustic map of the city, where sound moved through space in sequence, dictating the rhythm of life for everyone within earshot. Researchers studying medieval soundscapes have noted something interesting about how bells were perceived. When people in old villages are asked about the loudest sounds in their environment, they consistently identify church bells as among the most prominent, even when acoustic measurements show that other sounds are objectively louder. Sound is perceived socially. A bell that structures your entire day, that tells you when to wake and when to rest, and when your neighbour has died, is heard differently than background noise. It carries weight. It carries meaning. And in a medieval city, bells carried all of this from before sunrise until after you went to sleep. Can I ask you something? Can you imagine trying to have a quiet conversation while a tower bell rings at intervals you cannot predict? Not a small decorative bell, a tower bell, the kind that produces between 110 and 120 decibels at close range, roughly equivalent to standing near a jet engine. Even at street level, some distance from the tower, the sound registered at around 70 decibels, comparable to a busy open-plan office for hours, every day, from a source you could not turn off. But the bells were only the beginning. Because unlike the Rome of Julius Caesar, the medieval city was essentially a continuous marketplace. Every trade produced its own distinct contribution to the wall of sound. Blacksmiths who worked metal into every tool weapon, horseshoe and implement that civilization required were among the loudest. The ringing of hammer on anvil multiplied across dozens of smiths working simultaneously in a city's trade quarter, carried through an entire neighborhood from first light to last. By the 19th century, medical researchers had formally identified what they called blacksmith's deafness, a specific form of occupational hearing loss documented in the prestigious medical journal The Lancet, caused by decades of hammer work. This was not a new phenomenon. It was simply by then finally receiving a name and a scientific description. The blacksmiths of every medieval city had been going deaf for centuries. They simply had not had a word for it. Alongside the smiths, stonemasons chiselled and cracked stone for the endless construction of cathedrals that dominated urban life. Carpenters sawed and hammered. Coopers beat iron hoops onto wooden barrel staves in a rhythmic, incessant percussion. And over all of this rose the voices, market vendors crying their wares in the particular loud, practiced musical shout of someone who makes their living by being heard over everything else. And then there was the town crier, the official news distributor of the pre-industrial world, the person whose job was to stand in the public square and after ringing a bell shout at full voice, "Oyez, oyez, oyez," a phrase from the Old French meaning "hear ye," before delivering whatever official announcement the city needed everyone to know. One modern town crier measured for the record books produced 112.8 decibels at full cry, which means the town crier of a medieval English market town was on a busy afternoon producing roughly the same volume as a chainsaw, and this was simply the normal sound of public information. Now here is something that genuinely shifts the picture. We tend to assume that noise was simply worse in the pre-industrial world. More constant, more unavoidable, therefore more miserable. But historians of sound argue something more nuanced. The medieval noise was fundamentally different from our noise in a way that matters quite a lot. It was almost entirely made by living things, voices, animals, human hands striking human-made objects. Every sound had a direct physical cause that was visible and comprehensible. The blacksmith hammering was a blacksmith hammering. The horse clattering was a horse clattering. The bell ringing was being rung by a person with a specific purpose. None of the noise was anonymous. None of it emerged from invisible machinery or impersonal systems. This meant that the noise, however relentless, was also deeply social. It was the sound of people doing things, and there is a meaningful difference between the kind of exhaustion produced by noise you understand and can locate, and the kind produced by noise you cannot explain or trace to a source. A historian writing about the medieval soundscape makes a suggestion that I find genuinely fascinating. He proposes that if a medieval person were transported to our world, what they might find most disturbing about modern noise would not be the volume — our machines are certainly louder — but the strangeness. The millions of electronic buzzes and notification sounds and alerts that have no visible physical cause. Sounds that announce nothing specific, that require no response, that simply exist accumulating as a kind of low-grade sensory fog. In the medieval world, sound meant something. Even the most relentless noise pointed toward a person, an animal, an action you could see and understand. That does not make it less exhausting, but it makes it different in character from what we endure. And then there was the night time. Because even in the hours when the market had closed, when the smiths had put down their hammers, when the bells rang compline and fell quiet until matins, the night was not silent. The night watchman walked his circuit calling the hours. In England, his traditional cry went something like, 12 of the clock and all is well, every hour, all night, by a man whose explicit job was to ensure that no one slept so deeply they would miss a burglar or a fire. The novelist Tobias Smollett, writing in the 18th century, has a character rail against the watchman, with barely contained fury, writing that he starts, "Every hour from my sleep at the horrid noise of the watchman bawling the hour through every street and thundering at every door." And the author Robert Southey describes the custom with wry bemusement, noting that people grew so accustomed to the sound that they slept through it entirely, which rather defeats the purpose of the exercise, but which tells you something profound about the human capacity to simply absorb constant intrusion into the background rhythm of existence. You adapt. You stop hearing what has become ordinary. Eventually the man shouting the time outside your window is no louder than silence. The Roman poet Juvenal, remember, wrote a poem about his insomnia. He did not organize a petition. He did not move away. He wrote something that has survived for 2,000 years. And I think that impulse to transform annoyance into expression, to take the thing that drives you to distraction and find a way to say something true and even funny about it, is one of the most enduringly human responses to the relentless noise of the world. The noise is real. The complaint is real. But so is the poem. And speaking of things that settled in for the long term, because we have talked tonight about smell, about creatures sharing your space, and now about sound. But there is a fourth dimension of pre-industrial daily life that was in its own quiet way, perhaps the most disorienting of all. Not something you smelled or heard or crawled with, something you could not see. Because after the bells fell quiet and the market vendors went home, and the watchman called the midnight hour and moved on, there was darkness. Real darkness. The kind that does not exist in most of the world anymore. And what that darkness actually meant, not just for sleep, but for safety, for fear for the entire experience of being a person in the world after the sun went down, is where we are headed next. There is a particular kind of silence that happens right after you turn off the lights at night. That brief moment before your eyes adjust, before the faint glow of a phone screen or a streetlight through the curtain begins to reassure you. For most of us, that moment lasts maybe 2 or 3 seconds. Then the room softens, outlines appear, and you remember that you are perfectly safe. Now what if that moment never ended? What if the darkness that greeted you when you closed your eyes at night was the same darkness that was waiting when you opened them again, not softened, not relieved by any ambient glow from the street, just darkness, absolute and complete, pressing in from every corner of the room like something with weight? That was the night for virtually every human being who ever lived before the 19th century. And understanding what that actually meant, not romantically, not as a metaphor, but as a physical daily reality, changes something about the way you see history. Let us start with something simple. A candle. Today a candle is something you light when you want the room to feel cozy. When you're running a bath or setting a mood or someone's birthday cake needs a moment of magic. A candle is atmosphere. For most of human history, a candle was survival. It was the difference between being able to function after sundown and not. And it was expensive. Genuinely, deeply, significantly expensive. In medieval and early modern Europe, the most desirable candles were made from beeswax, clean, burning, minimal smoke, a warm, steady light. And they were completely out of reach for ordinary people. Only the church royalty and the very wealthy used beeswax candles with any regularity. Everyone else made do with tallow-rendered animal fat, usually from sheep or cattle, which burned smokier, smelled considerably worse, and required constant maintenance. Here is a detail that I find strangely affecting. A tallow candle had to be trimmed, the wick snuffed and adjusted roughly every 10 minutes. For better quality candles every 40 minutes or so, but tallow candles, some accounts suggest up to 40 times an hour. 40 times an hour. Think about that. You could not simply light a candle and settle in to read or sew or talk. Someone had to tend it almost constantly. The candle was as much a labour as a light source. And the phrase we still use today, the game is not worth the candle, meaning something is not worth the effort or the cost comes directly from this world. Because sometimes literally the activity you wanted to do was not important enough to justify burning through a candle to do it. The candle itself was the price of admission to any evening activity, and not everyone could pay it. For those who truly could not afford candles, which included a substantial portion of the population, particularly in rural areas, there was the rushlight. A rushlight was exactly what it sounds like. A rush. A type of wetland plant, the kind you might find growing at the edge of a pond, stripped of its outer bark except for a thin strip of support, then soaked in leftover grease or fat from cooking and dried. The result was a thin, fragile strip of dim light that lasted on average about 20 minutes. 20 minutes. For a family that had been working since before dawn, 20 minutes of light after the sun went down was the entire margin they had. The 18th century English naturalist Gilbert White, who wrote with great affection and precision about rural life in his village of Selborne, calculated that making a year's supply of rushlights for a household took roughly the same time and effort as other significant domestic tasks, not a trivial investment of labour. He noted that a single rushlight cost a fraction of a farthing less than the smallest coin in circulation, but even that multiplied across a year was a real expense for a family living close to the edge. And a housewife, White observed, might invite neighbours over to share a rushlight, sitting together in the same small pool of light, each one working on her mending or spinning for the 20 minutes before the light guttered and went out. A communal activity built entirely around the rationing of illumination. There is something in that image that I cannot quite shake. The intimacy of it, the sharing, the way light becomes something you gather around like warmth. But let us not be too romantic about it. Because darkness in the pre-industrial world was not just inconvenient, it was genuinely dangerous. Outside your home after sundown, a city street became something close to a different environment. A Swiss traveller named César de Saussure, visiting London in 1725, described the experience of navigating the city after dark with a mixture of fascination and unease. The streets that had been busy and legible during the day became at night a landscape of shadows and uncertain forms, patches of genuine blackness between the faint pools of light from lanterns, uneven ground underfoot, and the very real possibility of robbery. This was not paranoia. In the absence of any meaningful street lighting in most cities before the mid-18th century, darkness was a genuine operational advantage for anyone who wanted to do harm. The criminal justice records of cities like London are full of crimes committed specifically under cover of nightfall, in spaces where there was simply no light by which a victim could see an attacker's face, or a witness could identify anyone. Darkness was infrastructure. It protected the wrong people. And so to navigate London after dark, if you had any money at all, you hired a link boy. A link boy was exactly what the name implies. A boy usually quite young, sometimes as young as 10 or 12, who carried a burning torch called a link. You would find them waiting outside taverns and theatres and inns, ready to escort paying customers home through the dark streets. For a few coins, they would walk beside you or ahead of you, holding the flame high enough to light your path, and more importantly to make you visible enough that sensible criminals might look for easier prey elsewhere. It was a reasonable system. It was also deeply imperfect. Because some link boys, as historian A. Roger E. Kirch documents in his landmark study of the pre-industrial night, were themselves in league with the very thieves they were supposed to protect you from. The torch that was meant to light your way home would sometimes instead light the way for someone following behind you. The hired protector became the lure. Trust after dark in a city without street lighting was a complicated proposition. And then there was fire. Always hovering behind every flame and every candle and every rushlight was the possibility of fire. Not the inconvenient kind, not the kind where you call someone and they come and put it out. The kind that took an entire neighbourhood. The kind that moved faster than people could run. The kind that in a city of wooden buildings packed close together with straw on the floors and open flames in every room was not a question of if, only when. The Great Fire of London in 1666 began from a baker's oven and consumed roughly 13,000 houses in 4 days. But that was simply the largest and most documented of an almost continuous series of devastating urban fires across Europe and America during the pre-industrial period. Boston burned in 1676, Chicago in 1871, San Francisco in 1906, though that one had help from an earthquake. These were not freak accidents. They were the predictable consequence of building cities primarily from wood, and heating and lighting them with open flames. Night watchmen in medieval and early modern towns were given one instruction above all others: not to catch thieves, not to maintain order. The German watchman's traditional cry as he began his rounds through the village translated roughly as "take care of the fireplace and the candle." That was the primary message. That was the thing they feared most. Because fire in the dark, when no one was watching, was the true enemy of the night. Here is something that genuinely surprises most people when they first hear it. Before the Industrial Revolution, before gaslighting and then electric light transformed the night, most people in the Western world did not sleep the way we sleep. Not in one long block of 7 or 8 continuous hours. They slept in 2. A historian named A. Roger E. Kirch spent years combing through thousands of diaries, medical texts, legal records and works of literature from pre-industrial Europe and America. And what he found hidden in plain sight across more than 2,000 references in a dozen languages going back as far as ancient Greece was a pattern of sleep that had been completely erased from our cultural memory. People went to bed not long after dark. They slept for several hours, what they called their first sleep. Then sometime round midnight they naturally woke, not because something disturbed them, not because they were worried or sick. but because this was simply how human sleep worked in the absence of artificial light. They would lie in bed or get up for an hour or more. They would pray or reflect on their dreams, which were considered particularly vivid and meaningful during this interval. They would talk to a partner. They would visit a neighbour because this quiet, dark hour was apparently a normal time for gentle social calls. Some would go outside to check on animals. Some records suggest would simply lie awake in the dark thinking, and then eventually they would drift back into what they called their second sleep. A 16th century French physician named Laurent Joubert even addressed the timing of this waking interval in his medical writings, noting that the hours between first and second sleep were, according to his observation, the optimal time for couples to conceive children, because he wrote with disarming practicality, they have more enjoyment and do it better after the rest of the first sleep. This is a real medical recommendation, published by a doctor in the 16th century. I find this discovery, and it is genuinely one of the more quietly astonishing things in historical research, both fascinating and a little melancholy, because it raises a question I keep coming back to. Did our ancestors, sleeping in 2 segments, with a quiet waking hour in between, actually sleep better than we do? Did they have a relationship with the night that was more natural, more in tune with something in the human body that we have since disrupted? Kirch himself suggests that some of what we now diagnose as insomnia, specifically the experience of waking in the middle of the night and being unable to fall back asleep, may simply be the human body attempting to return to its ancestral pattern. A pattern that was perfectly normal for the vast majority of human history, and that was only classified as a problem once artificial light made single-block sleep the new standard. The Industrial Revolution did not just change how we worked, it changed how we rested, and we are still in some ways catching up. Think about what all of this adds up to. In a world before electric light, the night was not simply dark. It was active. It was complicated. It had its own economy of candles and rushlights and link buoys and tallow, its own dangers, fire, and criminals who understood how to use shadow. Its own rhythms, the 2-part sleep, the quiet waking hour, the sounds of the watchman calling the time on his rounds. And it was governed by an anxiety that most of us today have simply never had to feel. Not the dramatic anxiety of monsters under the bed. The quiet, practical, daily anxiety of knowing that the darkness outside your door was not something you controlled, that the flame you depended on was also the greatest threat to everything you owned, that the night in a very real sense was something you survived, not something you simply passed through on your way to morning. Can I ask you something while we are here in the quiet? The next time you wake up in the middle of the night and cannot immediately fall back asleep, that restless, slightly disoriented hour between 2 in the morning and 4, do you think you will remember this? That feeling of being awake in the dark, that impulse to think and drift and not quite sleep. Maybe that is not insomnia. Maybe that is something older, something the body remembers even if the mind has forgotten. A quiet hour that used to belong to the night, and with that thought settling in the darkness, softening just a little, the history of it, feeling somehow more personal, we move into a corner of pre-industrial life that is even more intimate, because we have talked about what people endured outside their doors and in their streets and in their uneasy nights. But we've not yet talked about what it meant to share that darkness with other people, with strangers, with everyone, in a world where the idea of sleeping alone was for most people a foreign concept, and where the bedroom as we know it simply did not exist. That story is coming up right now. Before we go any further, let me ask you something that might seem a little strange. When did you last sleep in the same bed as a total stranger, not a partner, not a family member, a complete stranger? Someone you had met perhaps an hour ago, someone whose name you barely knew. If you are like most people living today, the answer is probably never, or at least not since a particularly chaotic camping trip or a college road journey that went sideways. The very idea makes most of us uncomfortable, even a little indignant. My bed, my space, my sleep. These are things we guard with a kind of instinctive territorial certainty. And here is the thing. That feeling, that absolute bone-deep sense that your bed is yours and yours alone is one of the youngest ideas in human history. It is barely 200 years old. For the thousands of years before that, the assumption ran in precisely the opposite direction. Sleep was something you did together. Let us place ourselves at a roadside inn somewhere in England. The year is somewhere in the 14th or 15th century, the height of the medieval period, when travelling merchants, pilgrims and wandering workers moved constantly along the roads between cities. You've been walking since dawn. Your feet ache. Your back is complaining about the weight of your pack. You arrive at an inn just as the last of the daylight is fading, grateful beyond measure to find a roof and a fire. You pay for a night's accommodation. The innkeeper shows you to your room. The room contains 3 beds. Each bed contains 2 people you've never met. Your place is beside a wool merchant from somewhere to the north who is already half asleep and smells precisely as you would expect someone who's been walking all day to smell. And here is the extraordinary part. None of this strikes you as unusual. None of this is cause for complaint or alarm. This is simply how travelling works. When staying at an inn, medieval and early modern travellers routinely expected to share a bed with strangers. There were even etiquette manuals, actual written guides, that advised travellers on how to be a considerate bedfellow. The rules were straightforward. Lie still. Do not hog the blankets. Avoid fidgeting. Minimize contact. These were the standards by which you were judged as a decent civilized person when sharing a sleeping space with someone whose name you had not yet learned. And the inns themselves had a range of accommodations that reflected this communal approach to sleep. At the more modest establishments, there was a system so utilitarian it sounds almost comic. A long wooden bench ran along the wall. A rope was strung horizontally at roughly chest height parallel to the bench. Travellers would sit along the bench and drape their arms over the rope to support themselves while they dozed. In the morning, the innkeeper would come through and literally cut the rope, sending everyone pitching forward at once to signal the start of a new day. Some historians believe this practice gave rise to the English expression, to sleep on the rope. Whether or not that etymology is precisely correct, the image alone tells you something profound. At the cheapest end of the market, sleep was not a private, comfortable, restorative retreat. It was something you grabbed with both arms, literally for a few hours in a room full of strangers before the rope was cut and the day began again. Now the same principle applied inside homes and not just among the poor. In medieval great houses, the grand hall, that enormous central space where meals were served, business was conducted and festivities were held, became at nightfall a communal dormitory. Servants cleared away the trestle tables. People spread out blankets and cloaks on the rush-covered floor, and everyone slept in the same space side by side in rough order of social rank, with the more important members of the household closer to the fire. The concept of the bedroom as a dedicated private room for sleeping simply did not exist for most people. The word bedroom itself as a standalone term is a relatively modern invention. Before that, there was simply a chamber, a room, and the beds might be wherever there was space for them, in hallways, in parlours, in rooms that also served as workspaces or kitchens during the day. A researcher named Benjamin Rice, who has written extensively about the cultural history of sleep, puts it this way: none of the features that we now take as natural or normal in sleep, sleeping in a sealed private space alone or with at most one other person in silence for a continuous block of time, was in force anywhere in Europe or North America before roughly the year 1800. Not one of those features, Think about that. Every single aspect of what we consider normal sleep is essentially a product of the last 200 years. The family bed, and by family I mean something more expansive than we might assume, operated on its own internal logic. In many Irish households, historians have documented a specific arrangement. Parents in the middle, daughters. Along the wall side, the youngest closest to her mother's sons on the outer edge also arranged from youngest to oldest. Guests who arrived after dark and could not make it home were simply absorbed into this arrangement. Visitors would bed down with the family when darkness and bad weather made travelling home impossible. And there was nothing unusual or improper about this. It was hospitality. It was warmth, quite literally, because bodies generate heat, and in a home without central heating, packing into a shared bed was also a practical defence against the cold. In Scotland and Ireland during the 17th century, whole families slept on earthen floors covered with straw and rushes, with a single blanket or their daily clothes as the only covering. Farm animals were sometimes brought inside at night as well, not out of any particular affection for livestock, but because a cow or a pig generates considerable warmth, and because leaving animals outside in the cold made them vulnerable to thieves. So the nighttime household of a rural family in 17th century Ireland or Scotland might include several adults, multiple children, the family's dogs, and quite possibly a pig, all sharing one room, generating warmth and noise and smell in roughly equal measure. Pause here for just a moment because I want you to sit with something. How would you feel? Not in a judgment of them way they were doing what made sense, what was practical, what was warm and safe. But if you were transported back, if that were the texture of every night of your life, never alone, never quiet, never quite yours, would it feel suffocating? Or, and this is the question I keep coming back to, would there be something in the press of other breathing bodies in the dark that felt after a while like security, like proof that you were not alone in the world? I honestly do not know the answer, and I suspect that is exactly the point. Not everyone, of course, was resigned to complete chaos. The wealthy had options, and the most magnificent expression of wealth in the medieval and Tudor period was not, as you might imagine, fine art or grand architecture. It was the bed itself. A truly fine bed was often the single most valuable object a household owned. Not the house, not the land, the bed. Great beds of the Tudor period were architectural in scale, elaborately carved headboards, multiple layers of mattress straw first, then wool, then perhaps feathers on top. For the grandest households, heavy curtains hung on 4 posts that created an enclosed private space within the room. The curtains were not merely decorative, they are functional, they kept in warmth, they muffled noise, they provided a precious sliver of visual privacy within a space that was still in reality shared. And when a wealthy person died, the bed was considered important enough to be specified in their will. Beds were passed down through generations as significant inheritances alongside land and livestock and silver. In 1540, a woman named Marjorie Wren left her son Geoffrey a red and green bed canopy in her will. He apparently already owned the bed itself, which raises the mildly comic image of Geoffrey somewhere with a magnificent bed, but no canopy waiting to inherit the matching top piece. And then there is the Great Bed of Ware. If you've never heard of it, it is worth a moment. The Great Bed of Ware is a real object, it still exists, and you can see it today at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. It was built in the late 16th century for an inn in the town of Ware in Hertfordshire, England. It was designed quite deliberately as a tourist attraction, a bed as spectacle. It measures roughly 11 feet square, almost the size of a small room, and could accommodate, according to contemporary accounts, up to 15 people sleeping in it at once. 15. Shakespeare referenced it. Ben Jonson wrote about it. It became famous enough that people went out of their way to sleep in it not out of necessity, but because the experience of sleeping in the great bed of Ware was considered a remarkable thing to have done. A conversation piece, a story to tell, which tells you something interesting about the culture that a bed built for 15 people was considered extraordinary and worthy of fame rather than simply normal. Even then they understood that there was something almost absurd about it. They just had fewer options. There is one more tradition from this era of shared beds that I think deserves mention, because it is both unexpected and genuinely sweet in a slightly odd way. The practice was called bundling, and it was a recognised courtship custom in colonial New England and parts of Europe, particularly Wales and the Netherlands. Bundling involved an unmarried couple spending the night together in the same bed, but separated by a long wooden board placed down the middle of the mattress. Sometimes they were sewn into separate sacks. Sometimes a parent slept in the same room on the other side of a curtain. The idea was that the young couple could spend time together talking and becoming acquainted in the intimate hours of night without physical impropriety. It was a solution to a very practical problem. In a world where daylight hours were entirely consumed by labour and candles were expensive and winter nights were long and dark and cold, bundling gave courting couples a rare window of privacy, or something close to it in a world where privacy was almost non-existent. Colonial clergy argued about it. Some condemned it as dangerous, others defended it as perfectly innocent. The historical record suggests it was in practice somewhere in between, but what strikes me most about bundling is not its propriety or lack thereof. It is what it tells us about the hunger for connection that people carried through a world that offered them almost no space to themselves, even when they could finally carve out a moment apart from the household, from the hall, from the shared blankets and the communal warmth they chose to use that moment to be close to someone. Not alone, together, just with a board in the middle. This shift, when it finally came, was driven by several forces at once. The Industrial Revolution reshaped cities, creating houses with more rooms, each assigned a specific purpose. Victorian religious sensibilities declared that sharing a bed with strangers was improper. By 1875, an architectural magazine had published an essay stating that a bedroom used for anything other than sleeping was unwholesome and immoral, and by the late 19th century the private bedroom, sealed quiet, personal, had become not just an ideal but a marker of respectability of civilization. The communal sleeping arrangements of the previous centuries were recast as primitive, as something to have left behind. But here is what I find myself wondering. We gained something real when we gained our private rooms and our personal beds and our individual space in the night. We gained quiet. We gained rest. We gained the extraordinary luxury of a space that belongs entirely to us. But did we lose something too? Some of the people who lived in those shared rooms, under those shared blankets, in those drafty halls and crowded inns, they were never alone in the dark. Not really. There was always a breath beside them, always a body nearby, always the faint warmth of another person moving through the same night. And I wonder sometimes whether that the animal comfort of not being alone in the darkness was something that carried a quiet value we have not quite found a way to replace. Comfort, it turns out, has a complicated history, and the thing we call a good night's sleep was shaped for centuries by the most unromantic forces, imaginable cold poverty, the cost of candles, and the practical necessity of other human bodies. Which brings us rather naturally to the next discomfort people endured every single day, not at night, in broad daylight, at the table. Because before refrigeration, before food safety standards, before anyone truly understood what made food go bad and why eating was also in its own quiet way an act of faith, every single meal. Most evenings at some point you open a refrigerator. Maybe you're not even hungry. Maybe you just stand there for a moment looking at the organized shelves, the sealed containers, the neat rows of things that will still be fine in 3 days, 4 days a week, you close the door and you go find something else to do, and the refrigerator just stays there humming quietly, holding the entire problem of food preservation in a box invisibly without you having to think about it for even a second. That refrigerator is genuinely and without exaggeration one of the most consequential inventions in human history, not just for convenience, for survival. Because for the vast majority of human existence, the question of how to keep food edible, how to get it from the moment of harvest or slaughter to the moment it reached your mouth without becoming something that would harm you, was one of the central organizing challenges of daily life. It shaped what people ate when they ate it, where they could travel, how they planned their winters, and how much of their working life was devoted not to producing food, but simply to stopping it from disappearing. Here is something worth imagining. You have just slaughtered a pig. Not a small task. A pig is roughly 150 to 200 pounds of animal, and in a world without refrigeration, all of that meat begins to change the moment the animal is dead. Not in days, in hours. By the next morning, without intervention, you have a problem. So what do? You reach for salt. Enormous quantities of salt. You pack the meat in it. Rub it into every surface layer it deep, because salt draws moisture out, and moisture is what bacteria needs to multiply. You hang strips over smoke. You press cuts into earthenware jars and pour fat or brine over the top to seal out air. You work quickly and methodically, because the window between a fresh kill and a ruined one is not something you can negotiate with. The medieval household that slaughtered its pig in November was in a very real sense performing the one act that would determine the quality of the next several months of eating. Get it right, and you had salt pork through the worst of winter. Get it wrong, and the consequences range from unpleasant to genuinely dangerous. This is why in much of Northern Europe the autumn slaughter was not just a practical event. It was a ritual, a moment of communal significance. Families called in neighbours to help. The whole operation was organised around precision and speed, and the salt they used was not cheap or incidental. Salt was one of the most strategically important commodities in the pre-industrial world, so valuable that it gave its name to salary, that the word salary itself derives from the Latin salarium, believed by many historians to refer to the practice of paying Roman soldiers partly in salt or with allowances to purchase it. You were paid in something worth salting. But here is the thing about salt preservation that often gets left out. It worked, mostly, within limits. The limits being that saltpeter brine and smoking could not achieve what we now take for granted as baseline food safety. They slowed spoilage. They did not stop it. A piece of salt pork that had been packed correctly in November might still be perfectly edible in January, but a piece packed carelessly, or stored in conditions that were too warm or too damp, or simply kept a little too long, that piece might look and smell acceptable, while hiding something that would bring a grown adult to their knees within hours. People understood this imperfectly. They had noses, they had eyes, they knew broadly that old meat was a risk, but they did not have the vocabulary or the scientific framework to know precisely why. The germ theory of disease, the understanding that invisible microorganisms were responsible for spoilage and illness, was not established until the second half of the 19th century, through the work of scientists like Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch. Before that, people operated on instinct tradition, and a great deal of accumulated folk knowledge about what was safe and what was not. Some of that folk knowledge was excellent, some of it was dangerously incomplete. Now this is the point in the story where I have to address something, because you have probably heard at some point a version of the following explanation. People in the Middle Ages used enormous quantities of spices to cover up the taste of rotten meat. You might have heard it in school. You might have read it somewhere. It is a wonderful story. It is also, as multiple historians have now firmly established, largely a myth. and the reason it is a myth is wonderfully simple. Spices in medieval Europe were not a solution for rotten meat. They were more expensive than the meat itself. In the early 14th century, a pound of pepper, the cheapest and most common imported spice, cost roughly the same as an entire pig. A pound of ginger was worth approximately the same as a whole sheep. A pound of saffron in 15th century England would cost a skilled craftsman the equivalent of an entire month's wages. As the food historian and author of At Home Bill Bryson put it very neatly, the only people who could afford most spices were the ones least likely to have bad meat in the first place. And even if you had both bad meat and the spices to cover it, no combination of cinnamon and cloves and black pepper can make spoiled meat safe to eat. You would simply be paying an extraordinary amount of money to still end up unwell. What spices actually were in the medieval world was something far more interesting. They were status. They were medicine. They were proof visible on the banquet table that you had the wealth and connections to source goods that had travelled over 15,000 kilometres from their origin in the islands of South and Southeast Asia, through Arab and Venetian merchants, through Mediterranean ports, through a chain of middlemen whose markups compounded at every step, and still arrived fragrant and potent at your table. Nutmeg came exclusively from the Banda Islands in what is now Indonesia. Cloves came from a handful of neighbouring volcanic islands. Cinnamon was native to Sri Lanka. Black pepper grew along a single coast of southern India. The Dutch East India Company, recognising the extraordinary value of this concentration, went so far as to dip exported nutmeg seeds in lime, to prevent anyone from planting them elsewhere and breaking the monopoly. They reportedly earned a 7,500% profit on each shipment of nutmeg, 7,500% for a flavouring. And Columbus, when he sailed westward in 1492, was not looking for a new continent. He was looking for a faster route to pepper. The world was reorganized repeatedly in the pursuit of spice. So if spices were not for covering rotten meat, what did ordinary people actually do with food that had gone questionable? The honest answer is they made a judgment call. And the science of that judgment call was far more sophisticated than we might assume. Medieval urban regulations around food safety were in some cases surprisingly strict. In the city of York, records show that pork slaughtered within the city walls had to be sold within 24 hours, or the merchant faced a fine, not 24 days, 24 hours. Butchers who tried to pass off spoiled meat were subject to penalties that included public humiliation being paraded through the street, with the bad meat hung around their neck for everyone to see. It was not subtle, but it was effective. The mechanisms of enforcement existed because the problem was real and understood. People knew that rotten meat could make you sick. They simply did not know why, and so their defences against it were practical rather than scientific sensory inspection, strict timing, trusted sources, and a good nose. Where the food system became genuinely dangerous was not for most of history at the production end. It was in the processing. And nowhere is this more strikingly illustrated than in the Victorian food adulteration scandal, which is one of those chapters of history that sounds completely fictional until you look at the actual records. By the middle of the 19th century, Britain's rapidly expanding cities had created an enormous urban population that was almost entirely dependent on purchased food. These people, workers and labourers and factory hands, could not grow their own food, had no space to store it, and were buying their daily bread from commercial bakers who were in turn competing ferociously on price. What followed was in retrospect entirely predictable. By the 1840s, it was common practice for London bakers to add alum aluminum potassium sulfate to their bread. Not a small amount. An investigator named Arthur Hassel, whose meticulous work in the 1850s and 1860s exposed the scale of food adulteration in Britain, found that roughly half of all bread he examined contained significant quantities of alum. Half. Alum made bread whiter, which consumers preferred. It made bread denser, which meant it held more water weight, which meant bakers could charge more for less actual flour. And it interfered with digestion in ways that, particularly for children who were eating little else, contributed to malnutrition and bone disease. But alum was not the worst of it. Victorian bread had been found to contain chalk ground bone plaster of Paris, and in some cases copper sulfate, the milk that working-class Londoners bought for their children. Children who had no other source of calcium or fat-soluble vitamins, was routinely diluted with water and whitened with chalk to disguise the dilution. Punch magazine, that great Victorian satirical publication, described the product with devastating accuracy as milk from the pump and chalk pit without ever having been possessed of a cow. Beer was diluted and laced with molasses licorice, and in some cases a plant-derived intoxicant called Cocculus indicus. Tea was bulked out with ash leaves, elder leaves, and sloe. Coffee was mixed with ground peas and beans. A government report from 1856 found that in Britain approximately 3/4 of all food on sale had been adulterated in some way. 3/4. The philosopher might ask how a population can have a food problem when there is food everywhere. The answer in Victorian Britain was that the food existed, but it was not entirely food. It took an Act of Parliament, specifically the Sale of Food and Drugs Act of 1875, passed after years of campaigning, to begin establishing the framework of food standards and public inspection that eventually became the food safety system we rely on today. Now, and this is the part I genuinely love because it has a twist here, is something worth pausing on. The next time you read an ingredient label on packaged food and feel a flicker of unease about some long chemical-sounding name you do not recognize, remember this. The regulation that created that label, the entire system of ingredient disclosure and food safety testing, and permitted additive lists, all of it exists because Victorian chemists and social reformers looked at what was being sold to ordinary people and said clearly and loudly that this was unacceptable. The label you find slightly suspicious is the direct descendant of Arthur Hassel's microscope and his careful, patient outrage documentation of what he found in bread that was supposed to be bread. The suspicion that someone is putting something in your food that should not be there. That suspicion, it turns out, is completely historically grounded. The difference is that now there are consequences for it. And that word consequences brings me to something larger. Food throughout history was not just fuel. It was negotiation. It was chemistry. It was trust between seller and buyer, between harvest and stomach, between what the season offered and what the body needed. Every technique people developed, the salting, the smoking, the pickling, the fermenting, the careful timing, the sharp-nosed judgment at the market stall was a response to the fundamental vulnerability of eating in a world where the food itself could not be assumed to be safe. We have largely engineered our way out of that vulnerability, and we have done it so completely that most of us have entirely forgotten it was ever there, which brings us to something else entirely. Because we have been talking in one way or another about what it meant to live in a body in the pre-industrial world, the smells that surrounded that body, the creatures that shared its space, the darkness it navigated, the beds it occupied, the food that sustained it. But we have not yet talked about the body itself, what it felt like from the inside to simply exist in skin and bone before aspirin, before corrective lenses, before anything as basic as a comfortable shoe. Because on top of everything else we've explored tonight, the pre-industrial body was also, and I say this with the greatest possible compassion for everyone who ever lived before us, almost continuously uncomfortable, and that story's coming up right now. Right now, at this very moment, your body's probably doing something almost miraculous. It is keeping you warm. It is breathing without you thinking about it. It is managing 1,000 small physical adjustments to pressure, to temperature, to the softness of whatever you are lying on without once asking for your conscious attention. And it is probably at this moment not in pain, or at least if there is some minor ache or tension somewhere, you have the quiet option of reaching for a painkiller, adjusting your position, or simply knowing that whatever this discomfort is, it will pass, and there are tools available to help it pass faster. That quiet confidence, that background assumption that pain is a temporary visitor and not a permanent roommate is one of the most extraordinary luxuries of modern life, and most of us do not even know we have it. The pre-industrial body was a different kind of experience, not because people were constitutionally weaker or less able to tolerate discomfort, but because pain for most of human history was simply more present, more constant, more unresolved. And it lived in places we rarely think about now, in the feet, in the mouth, in the eyes, in the back, grinding away at daily life, in ways that had no elegant solution and no real relief. Let us start with something almost laughably simple. Shoes. I want you to take off one of your shoes if you're wearing any, and look at it for a moment. Notice that it is shaped differently from the other one. The right shoe curves one way, the left shoe curves the other. This seems obvious, so obvious that it barely warrants mentioning. Your feet, after all, are mirror images of each other. Of course, your shoe should reflect that. Here is the thing. For the vast majority of human history, they did not. From around the 14th century, before the Common Era in Egypt, until the middle of the 19th century, a span of roughly 3,000 years, shoes across most of the Western world were made on what cobblers called straight lasts. A last is the form usually carved from wood around which a shoe is built, and a straight last produced a shoe that had no left or right orientation whatsoever. It was symmetrical. You could put it on either foot. In practice, you put it on whichever foot was most convenient, and then you walked, and it hurt. Because a human foot is not symmetrical. The arch, the heel, the distribution of weight, everything about the human foot assumes that the left shoe will go on the left foot and the right shoe will go on the right foot. Wearing shoes that made no such assumption produced, as you might imagine, significant discomfort. Wealthy people had a solution for this, and it is one of the more entertaining details in the social history of clothing. They made their servants break in new shoes first. Specifically, the servant would wear the shoes until the stiff leather had softened and moulded itself to a human foot, any foot, and only then would the wealthy owner put them on and enjoy the relative comfort of preformed leather. The servant's feet were in effect the price of admission to a comfortable pair of shoes. For everyone else, the solution was to soak the shoes in water and simply wear them walking in damp, stiff leather, until your own feet had done the breaking in themselves. It was not until the early 19th century, specifically around 1817, when a Philadelphia cobbler named William Young reportedly began differentiating between left and right lasts, that the idea of making shoes specifically shaped for each foot began to slowly spread. Slowly. Even by the 1890s, some shoemakers were still producing shoes on straight lasts. 3,000 years of symmetrical footwear, ended quietly by one cobbler in Philadelphia. But as physically irritating as uncomfortable shoes were, they were nothing compared to the problem that occupied a great deal more of people's mental and emotional energy across all of human history. Toothache. There is a line I came across while researching this that I have not been able to stop thinking about. It comes from the archives of a dental history collection documenting the testimony of people throughout history who described what a toothache felt like. The phrases recorded include, among the worst of tortures, one of the sharpest of pains, a gnawing vengeance, and my personal favourite, an inferno of pain. That last one comes from a historical source, not a modern person, and I believe it completely. Because a serious toothache in the pre-modern world was not something you treated with a quick appointment and a small injection of local anaesthetic. It was something you endured, for days, sometimes for weeks, sometimes until the infection resolved itself, or the tooth finally gave out, which could mean the infection spread further with consequences that were genuinely serious. Medieval medical literature is quite candid about the limits of what could be done. A physician named John of Gaddesden, writing around 1314, includes in his medical treatise a section on toothache that lists alongside legitimate herbal preparations a range of alternative approaches. He mentions that praying to Saint Apollonia on her feast day, February the 9th, was said to cure toothache. He notes that one could draw 3 vertical lines on parchment while touching the aching tooth with a finger. He records that some practitioners recommended a needle used to pierce a many-footed worm be then touched to the offending tooth, transferring the pain from one creature to another. And he mentions, without appearing entirely convinced, that hanging a magpie beak around one's neck was said to help. To be fair to John of Gaddesden, he was also recording willow bark preparations and herbal poultices that contained what we now know to be genuinely active compounds. Willow bark contains salicylic acid, the natural precursor to the active ingredient in aspirin. But the prayer to Saint Apollonia and the magpie beak sit right alongside the willow bark in his medical text, because when you have a serious toothache and no real options, you try everything. Aspirin as we know it, acetyl salicylic acid synthesized into a stable standardized form, was not produced until 1897, when a German chemist named Felix Hoffmann developed it at the Bayer Pharmaceutical Laboratory. Before that, for all of recorded human history, the gap between something hurts and here is reliable relief was enormous, and tooth extraction, the last resort, was performed by barber surgeons. The same person who cut your hair could, if necessary, also pull your teeth using crude metal forceps without anesthetic in conditions that made post-procedure infection a serious and common risk. The extraction was considered so dangerous that it was genuinely a last resort. Better to endure the toothache a while longer than to face the alternative. Now here is something that shifts this picture in an interesting direction, because I do not want you to walk away from this with the image of pre-industrial people as simply suffering without understanding. They were remarkably ingenious, and some of their insights were centuries ahead of the science that would eventually catch up to them. Archaeological evidence from a site in Pakistan shows that humans were drilling into teeth to clean out decay as far back as 9,000 years ago. 9,000. Using flint-tip tools with a precision that archaeologists describe as genuinely impressive for the era. In Slovenia, a 6,500-year-old human jaw was found with a tooth cavity filled with beeswax, a material that, as modern analysis has confirmed, has actual antibacterial and anti-inflammatory properties. Someone 6,500 years ago understood that a cavity needed to be sealed and chose a material that was not only practical, but in a quiet biochemical way medically sound. They did not know why it worked. They just knew it worked. That gap between knowing something works and understanding why it works is one of the most human things in all of medical history. And then there were the eyes. Here is a question worth sitting with for a moment. If you wear glasses or contact lenses, or if your eyesight began to decline as you got older, have you ever thought about what your life would look like without them? Not as a philosophical exercise. Just practically. Could you do your job? Could you read? Could you recognize faces at a distance? For millions of people throughout history, that was simply the condition of life after a certain age. Vision declined and there was nothing to be done about it. Until there was. The first European eyeglasses appeared in Italy in the late 13th century, most likely around the year 1284 in or near the city of Pisa. A Dominican friar named Fra Giordano of Pisa, delivering a sermon in 1306, described the invention with a kind of awe that I find genuinely touching. He said it had been not yet 20 years since The art of making spectacles, one of the best and most necessary arts in the world, had been discovered, and he added, "I myself saw the man who discovered and practiced it, and I talked with him." Think about what this meant. Before 1284, if you were a scholar or a scribe or a craftsman who needed fine vision for your work and your eyesight began to fail as you aged, your working life was effectively over. The medieval equivalent of retiring due to vision impairment was not an exaggeration. It was simply a fact of getting older. After 1284, it was not inevitable anymore. But the rollout was slow. Early glasses had convex lenses only. They helped people focus on close objects, which was useful for reading. Concave lenses for nearsightedness for people who could not see clearly at a distance did not appear until the 15th century, and for most ordinary people, glasses remained expensive and inaccessible for generations. A friar in Pisa who had talked to the inventor could describe the discovery with reverence. The peasant in the field who needed those glasses to see clearly could not afford them. That gap between an invention existing and an invention being available to everyone is a recurring theme in the history of human comfort, and it is still in many parts of the world unresolved. The clothing situation deserves a moment too, because it touches on something that goes beyond mere inconvenience. Fabric before industrialization was made by hand, every thread spun, every yard woven. This made cloth genuinely expensive, often one of the most valuable things a household owned. And because cloth was expensive, clothing was not abundant. Most people owned 2 or 3 sets of clothes at most. They wore them every day. They slept in them. They worked in them. And the fabrics available to ordinary people, rough wool, coarse linen, were not designed with comfort as the primary consideration. They were designed to last. A wool tunic that kept you warm in winter was the same wool tunic you wore in summer. Layering and unlayering was the primary tool for temperature regulation. And for women particularly, the physical demands of clothing were significant. Long, heavy skirts that drag through the same streets we discussed earlier, collecting everything those streets had to offer. Stays and foundation garments that were structural rather than comfortable. Head coverings worn in all weathers, both indoors and out. The idea that clothing should move with the body, breathe with the body, flex, and adapt to the body's needs, that is a genuinely modern concept. For most of history, the body adapted to the clothing, not the other way around. And over all of this, over the aching feet and the toothache and the blurring vision and the rigid clothing, there was no aspirin. Let that sit for a moment. No aspirin. No ibuprofen, no paracetamol, no reliable standardized dose-controlled pain relief of any kind. There was willow bark tea which worked imperfectly and inconsistently. There was opium which was available to those who could find and afford it, and which came with its own significant costs. There was alcohol which dulled rather than healed. And there was endurance. The vast, quiet, unrecorded endurance of billions of people who simply got up every morning and went about their lives with a background hum of physical discomfort that we would today consider unacceptable. They did not complain about it in the way we might imagine, not because they were stoic in a philosophical sense, but because complaining required an audience who understood there was another way, and for most of history there was no other way. I think about this sometimes when I reach for a tablet because I have a headache. The act takes 3 seconds. I do not think about it. I barely register it as a decision. But somewhere in the background of that 3-second act is an enormous amount of history. Thousands of years of people with headaches who could only wait. One chemist in Germany in 1897 who synthesized a molecule that changed the experience of being a human body, and all the people between then and now who worked slowly to make that molecule cheap enough and available enough that I can reach for it without thinking, all of which leads us somewhere interesting. Because if you accept the idea that the pre-industrial body was more uncomfortable than we typically imagine, the aching feet, the failing eyes, the untreated pain, then you have to reckon with an obvious question. How did people deal with it? Not just physically, but in terms of temperature. Because before central heating, before insulated walls, before wool-lined, everything was simply not enough winter. In Europe was not a season, it was a siege. And the way people survived it, the things they built and burned and shared to make it through, is a story that says something profound about human ingenuity under pressure. That is exactly where we are headed next. Cold is something most of us experience as an inconvenience. A sweater pulled on, a thermostat adjusted, a car that takes an extra minute to warm up. We feel cold, and then we do something about it, and then we stop feeling cold. The whole interaction rarely lasts longer than a few minutes, but cold for most of human history was not something you resolved. It was something you negotiated with. Every single day from the first frost of autumn to the last grey weeks of winter, cold was a constant presence, not in the dramatic survival movie sense of imminent death from exposure, but in the quieter, more grinding sense of something you could never fully escape. It lived in the walls, it crept up through the floor, it sat in the corners of rooms that a single fire could never quite reach. And learning to live with that, to build your life, your routines, your architecture around a cold that never fully left, is one of the most quietly remarkable things about the pre-industrial world. Let us start with the house itself. A medieval peasant's home in northern Europe was a single room, roughly. It might have had a partition or two, but the essential reality was one shared space. Sleeping, cooking, eating, working, often sheltering the animals as well. In the centre of this room, or along one wall if there was a hearth built into the stone, was the fire. Not a fireplace in our sense, a contained decorative element behind a grate. A fire pit, open, fueled by wood, sometimes peat, occasionally dry dung. And the smoke from this fire rose and spread through the room before drifting out through a hole in the roof, because the chimney, the architecturally clever invention that channels smoke upward and out, was not common in ordinary homes until the 12th century at the earliest, and did not reach widespread use among ordinary people for centuries after that. Before the chimney fire meant smoke, and smoke meant that the air inside a medieval home, particularly in winter, when the fire burned longest and the ventilation was minimal, was not what we would consider comfortable. A thin, persistent haze, ceilings blackened by years of accumulated soot, eyes that adjusted over a lifetime to conditions that would send a modern visitor reaching for the door. But here is the thing about that fire. It was the centre of everything, not just heat, not just cooking. It was light. It was community. It was the reason people gathered in the same space rather than dispersing to separate rooms. The fire was the irreplaceable heart of the home, and around it in winter the entire household lived. Now here is something that I think genuinely deserves a moment of quiet astonishment. During the period roughly between 1300 and 1850, much of Europe, particularly northwestern Europe, experienced what climatologists call the Little Ice Age, a period of significant regional cooling that produced winters substantially harsher than anything most of us have ever experienced. Average temperatures in the British Isles dropped by as much as 2 degrees Celsius compared to the preceding warm period. That might not sound dramatic, but in climatological terms 2 degrees is enormous. It is the difference between rivers staying liquid and rivers turning to ice. And turn to ice they did. Between 1400 and 1815, the River Thames in London froze over completely at least 24 times. The Thames, one of the largest rivers in England, frozen solid enough to walk on, to build on, to hold a fair on. The earliest recorded frost fair took place in 1608. People came out onto the ice and played football, wrestled and danced on the frozen surface of what was normally one of the busiest waterways in the country. 12 years later, in the frost of 1621, the ice was so thick that teenagers apparently felt confident enough to light a fire and burn a gallon of wine directly on the Thames, on the river, because it was at that point essentially a very cold floor. And then there was the winter of 1683 to 1684, the coldest winter in the English instrumental record. The Thames froze for 7 consecutive weeks. A physician named John Downes, who kept careful records at the time, noted temperatures of around -4 degrees Celsius indoors and -12 degrees Celsius outdoors. -4 degrees Celsius inside the building, with the fire burning. The cold was not something you escaped by going home. During the Great Frost of 1684, a frost fair spread across the ice so large and so organised that it essentially became a temporary city. It extended for roughly 3 miles along the frozen river. King Charles II came with the royal family. Paupers came too. Stalls sold beer, wine, coffee, brandy, beef oysters, gingerbread and spiced pies. People went sledging, skating, bowling, dancing. There were puppet shows, peep shows featuring tame monkeys, fire eaters, and at least one lottery. And one particularly entrepreneurial printer named George Davis set up a full printing press on the ice, and for a small fee would print your name on a souvenir card commemorating your visit to the frozen river. The city had turned its disaster into a festival, which is, and I say this with genuine admiration, an extraordinarily human response to a terrible winter. But the festival had a shadow. In the same winter of 1684, burials across London were suspended for weeks because the ground was frozen too hard to dig graves. Trees split apart under the pressure of expanding ice inside their trunks, a sound described by contemporary witnesses as like the crack of a gunshot. Some preachers declared the frost to be divine punishment and called for public repentance. And the poor who could not afford enough fuel to keep themselves warm were simply dying. Now here is a detail that I find almost unbearable in its specificity. In those winters in ordinary homes across England and France and the Netherlands, it was not uncommon for ink to freeze inside the inkwell sitting on the writing desk. Not outside, inside, on the desk, in the room where people worked and wrote and tried to conduct the ordinary business of their lives. There are diary entries from educated people of the 17th and 18th centuries, mentioning almost as a matter of routine that they had to warm their ink before they could write their morning correspondence. Just part of the morning, like how we might make coffee first, warm the ink, then write. The temperature inside your own home was simply not something you controlled. It was something you accommodated. Different cultures found different solutions to this, and some of them are genuinely fascinating. In Russia for centuries, the heart of the traditional peasant home was not a fire pit or a fireplace, but a great masonry stove, a structure so large it dominated the entire room. It was used for heating, for cooking, for drying clothes and herbs and food, and for sleeping. The stove would be heated in the morning, and once it reached temperature, it would continue radiating warmth for hours. The sleeping area, called the polot, was built on shelves installed between the wall and the top of the stove. 6 people could sleep up there at once, nestled against the warm ceramic surface above the cold that settled lower in the room. Children who were too small to climb were lowered in on a specially designed wooden spade. Think about that. You would sleep on top of your stove, not as a desperation measure, as the designed, intended, perfectly logical sleeping arrangement for a household that understood exactly where the warmth went. In France and parts of the Netherlands, a different approach emerged during the most brutal winters of the Little Ice Age. Some peasant communities essentially hibernated, not literally in the way bears do, but close. When the cold reached its worst and the food supplies were low and the fuel was running out, entire villages would slow to an almost complete stop. People would stay in bed for most of the day, conserving warmth, eating as little as possible to stretch the stores, moving only when necessary. A French traveller documenting peasant life in the early 19th century wrote with something between amazement and distress about finding villages in which entire families had simply taken to their beds for the winter, emerging only briefly each day to check on the animals and keep the fire barely alive. It is an image that sounds medieval, but it was happening within living memory of people who were alive during the American Civil War. Winter in those places was not just cold. It was a kind of enforced stillness that the body imposed because the alternative moving, burning calories, staying warm through activity simply cost more than the food supply could support. What does a person do when they cannot make themselves warm enough? They build architecture around the problem. In the Palace of Westminster in London, records from the 1230s show that windows were being glazed specifically because the rooms were, and this is the actual complaint recorded in the historical document, too windy. Not decoratively, not for beauty, because the people living and working inside the palace could not otherwise function. Meanwhile, in ordinary homes where glass was entirely unaffordable, people sealed their window openings with oiled paper, with scraped animal skin, with whatever thin membrane could block the wind without blocking all the light. In southern France, on the island of Maguelone, the windows of a cathedral complex were sealed with mortar every winter and reopened each spring. Mortared shut every year, and then reopened. The cold was so regular, so predictable, so unavoidable that this had become a seasonal rhythm seal. The windows in autumn opened them in spring the way we might set a thermostat. They were not passive in the face of the cold. They were ingeniously active. They just had to work so much harder for results we now achieve by pressing a button. Firewood deserves its own mention because the economics of fuel in a pre-central heating world are staggering in their implications. Running out of firewood in midwinter was not an inconvenience. It was a potential death sentence. Specifically, it meant that you could not perform the physical labour required to acquire more firewood because you were too cold, and so the situation became self-reinforcing in the worst possible way. Medieval households in England and France devoted a significant portion of autumn labour to wood cutting and storage. Not because they were being especially organised, because failing to do so could mean not surviving February. In parts of Russia, contemporaries recorded that the peasants kept their fuel as carefully as their food, which is to say, with the kind of anxious attention that anyone who has ever genuinely not known where their next resource was coming from will recognise immediately. And the wealthy, of course, solved this problem with money. In 19th century England, the great house of Whitley Court in Worcestershire burned through 30 tons of coal every single day to keep itself warm. 30 tons per day. The house had a network of underground tunnels specifically designed for moving coal efficiently from storage to the many fireplaces distributed throughout the building. A technological solution to the coal distribution problem of keeping an enormous house warm in winter. For everyone who was not living in Whitley Court, the solution was simpler and harder. You wore more, you moved less, you gathered closer, you made do. What I find most striking about all of this is not the suffering, it is the creativity. The Russian stove-sleeping shelf, the French hibernation, the stone-sealed windows of Maguelone, the Thames frost fair. None of these are the responses of a defeated people. They are the responses of people who understood their situation clearly and chose to work with what they had rather than simply endure what they could not change. That distinction between enduring and adapting is one of the most important things I think we can take from this part of history. The cold was real. It was relentless. It shaped everything from the architecture of houses to the design of clothing to the rhythms of sleep. But it did not stop people from writing, from trading, from building cathedrals, from printing books on frozen rivers. They adapted, they innovated, They threw a party on the ice. And speaking of things that were cold, hard, and difficult to navigate, we have spent a lot of this evening inside homes and bodies and beds. But there is a world outside those walls that we have only touched on briefly. Streets that were not just cold. Streets that were for most of history genuinely and impressively unpleasant to walk through for reasons that go well beyond the weather. Because before the modern city, before drainage and paving and sanitation infrastructure, the street was not simply where you travelled. It was where everything ended up, and understanding what that looked like and smelled like, and how people navigated it on a daily basis, adds one more layer to this picture of daily life that I think you will find genuinely surprising. Walking is one of the simplest things a human body does. You do it without thinking. You step out the door, put one foot in front of the other, and the world unfolds around you. Most of us, when we think about city streets in history, picture something vaguely romantic. Cobblestones, cloaked figures moving through lamplight, the clatter of horses on narrow lanes. And all of that is accurate. What the romantic version leaves out is what you would be walking through. Because the pre-industrial city street was not just a thoroughfare, it was a disposal system, the only disposal system most cities had. And understanding what that actually meant in physical sensory daily terms turns the whole image of urban history inside out. Let us establish something clearly right at the beginning. The chamber pot. If you lived in a city before the mid-19th century, and you did not have access to a private privy or an outdoor cesspool, your bathroom was a ceramic vessel kept under the bed or in a corner of the room. When it was full or when morning came, you emptied it. Not into a drain, not into a designated facility, out the window, onto the street below. If you were considerate, you shouted a warning first. The French phrase was "garde l'eau," watch out for the water. An elegant locution for something that was categorically not water. Men over time evolved a habit of walking on the outside of a footpath nearest the street, partly as a gesture of chivalry toward whoever they were walking with, and partly because the outside position was closer to the trajectory of whatever might come flying out of an upper story window. It was not random. It was a calculated spatial arrangement based on an intimate understanding of urban projectile dynamics. Ladies, for their part, tended to walk close to the buildings where the angle of descent meant they were less likely to receive a direct impact. These were not written rules. They were simply how you navigated a city. Now, the chamber pot was only part of the story, because cities also contained horses, enormous numbers of horses. In the Victorian era, London had somewhere between 50,000 and 300,000 working horses at any given time. New York City at the turn of the 20th century had between 100,000 and 200,000. Each horse produces somewhere between 10 and 15 kilograms of manure every single day, and several litres of urine. In a city of 100,000 horses, that is somewhere between 1 and 1.5 million kilograms of manure produced daily. Before the automobile, before any kind of mechanized waste management, when the primary tool for dealing with it was a man with a shovel and a cart. The situation was so severe in New York City by the late 19th century that in some neighborhoods, the accumulated manure on streets rose to heights of between 2 and 6 feet in winter, when frozen waste compacted with snow and was simply left to pile up. 6 feet, the height of a tall person, in manure on a city street, in New York City, not medieval, the 1890s. Horse carcasses presented an additional and particularly grim problem. A dead horse is a very large object, far too heavy for a person to move alone, and in a city that had no organized system for removing them, a dead horse simply stayed where it fell, in the street, until it decomposed enough that it could be broken apart and carried away in pieces. Contemporary accounts from London and New York describe streets where dead horses lay for days, sometimes longer. The smell in summer is left to the imagination. The flies they attracted, given that horse manure was their primary breeding ground, were so numerous that a scientist at the United States Bureau of Entomology estimated in 1895 that 95% of all flies in America originated from horse manure. 95% of all flies from horse manure. The crisis came to a head in a very specific and fascinating way in 1894. A newspaper in London published a prediction backed by straightforward extrapolation from current rates of growth that by the year 1950 every street in London would be buried under 9 feet of horse manure. The prediction was not lunacy, it was arithmetic. More people meant more transportation. More transportation meant more horses. More horses meant more manure, and the rate of growth showed no sign of reversing. The same concern was serious enough that in 1898 the first International Urban Planning Conference was held in New York City, gathering representatives from cities around the world to discuss, among other things, the horse manure problem. The conference was scheduled for 10 days. By the third day, the delegates had essentially run out of ideas. The conference disbanded early. No solution was found. Then within a decade the automobile arrived, and history took a turn that nobody at the 1898 conference had seen coming. The horse manure problem was solved not by any plan or policy, but by a technology that nobody had yet invented. But this was the 19th century. Go back further to the medieval and early modern city, and the picture is both similar and in some ways even less navigable. Because the medieval city had horses' livestock chamber pots, and also the open drainage channel, known in English records as the kennel, not the kind you put a dog in, but a word meaning a gutter, or drain. The kennel was a channel running down the centre, or sides of a street designed to carry liquid waste toward the edge of the town, or into a nearby river. In principle, an elegant solution. In practice, a shallow, open river of every kind of waste a city produces, moving slowly through the streets at the speed of gravity and occasional rainfall. Medieval city ordinances attempted to regulate this. London records from the 13th century include prohibitions against dumping various types of waste in the street. In 1357, King Edward III wrote to the Lord Mayor of London complaining about the great masses of dung and other filth which had accumulated in the streets and lanes of the city, noting that it made the city foul with the putrid exhalations therefrom. The king himself was complaining about the smell of the streets. This was not a small or occasional problem. It was a permanent condition of urban life managed through incomplete measures, partially mitigated by rain, and essentially tolerated as the cost of living in a city. And here is where the story gets both interesting and a little absurd. Because people adapted. Not just psychologically, not just by learning to ignore the smell, but architecturally, physically, in their fashion. Consider the chopine. If you have never encountered a chopine, it is one of those historical objects that you have to see to fully appreciate. A chopine is a platform shoe, essentially a very tall wooden or cork base, sometimes covered in luxurious fabric, sometimes elaborately decorated, worn underneath a dress in Venice and Spain, during the 15th, 16th and 17th centuries. The point was simple. The streets were covered in waste. An expensive dress dragging through the streets of Venice would be ruined. So you elevated yourself above the problem, literally, by standing on a wooden platform. Some chopines reached heights of 20 inches. 20 inches of platform shoe worn on a city street because the alternative was stepping through what the street actually contained. Venetian law in 1430 tried to limit chopines to a maximum height of 3 inches. Nobody paid much attention. Women who wore the tallest chopines required 2 servants walking alongside to keep them from falling over. Queen Isabella of Spain's own confessor, a man of some theological gravity, reportedly said that there was Not enough cork in all of Spain to meet the needs of women in regard to their chopines. He was not admiring, he was exhausted. Shakespeare himself made a joke about chopines in Hamlet using the word altitude to describe the height they gave their wearers. A fashion born of filth, elevated into art noted by poets and restricted by law. That is the chopine. The gentlemen had their own adaptations. Broad-brimmed hats became popular in part because they protected the wearer from whatever might come descending from an upper-story window. High heels on men's shoes. Yes, men wore them first and wore them for centuries, evolved at least partly from the practical need to keep the bottom of expensive trousers out of what the streets contained. The crossing sweeper became an established urban profession. These were boys, mostly who positioned themselves at busy intersections, and for a small payment from a pedestrian wishing to cross swept a clear path through the accumulated filth, so that the paying customer could cross without ruining their footwear. In London during the Victorian era, crossing sweepers were a fixture of city life visible in paintings, mentioned in novels, an accepted feature of urban infrastructure. The fact that their job needed to exist tells you everything about the condition of the streets. There is a statistic I keep returning to because I think it captures the scale of what was happening in a way that purely descriptive language cannot quite reach. In the year 1900, New York City collected approximately 500 tons of horse manure from its streets every single day. 500 tons per day. And this was considered more or less manageable by the standards of the time because by 1900 the city had organized collection crews, the men in white uniforms known as the White Wings, hired by Sanitation Chief George Waring Jr., doing systematic sweeps of major avenues. Before that, the situation had been considerably worse. I think what strikes me most about all of this, and I want to be honest about this reaction, is not the disgust exactly. It is more like vertigo. The vertigo of realizing how recent all of this is. The clean street, the covered drain, the absence of animal waste from the place where you walk. These are not ancient achievements won thousands of years ago. They are modern ones. Within living memory of some of the oldest people alive today, horses were still a common sight on city streets. The transition from the horse-drawn to the motorized city happened within a few decades around the early 20th century, and the engineering that made streets walkable, the underground drainage systems, the water treatment facilities, the organized waste collection that was mostly built within the last 150 years, not millennia, decades. And the reason I want to linger on this for a moment is because it connects to something larger. Throughout this entire journey tonight, through the smells and the bugs and the darkness and the shared beds and the bad food and the aching bodies and the frozen winters and now these streets, there is a single thread running underneath all of it. Not suffering, not resignation, but the constant, relentless human drive to fix things. Every problem we have talked about tonight produced eventually a solution. Not always quickly, not always gracefully. Sometimes it took a crisis. Sometimes it took a king complaining about the smell from his palace window. Sometimes it took a woman wearing 20-inch platform shoes and 2 servants to hold her upright before someone finally decided to do something about the streets. But the impulse was always there. This is unbearable. We can do better. And speaking of doing better, we have one more truly extraordinary annoyance to explore. Because we have covered what people lived in and walked through and ate and wore and felt in their bodies. But we have not yet talked about the one thing that connected all of these experiences, the one resource so fundamental that without it, none of the solutions we have discussed would have been possible. Information, or more precisely, the agonizing, maddening, world-altering problem of getting information from one place to another before anyone had figured out how to do it reliably. Because before the telegraph, before the newspaper, before the reliable postal system, not knowing things was one of the most constant grinding annoyances of daily life, and the lengths people went to in order to close that gap are both astonishing and in a way that I think you will find deeply familiar, completely human. Think about the last time you found out some important news, a family announcement, something happening in the world, a message from someone you love. Whatever it was, you probably found out about it within minutes or hours at the most. You may not have even been looking for it. It found you on a screen through a notification in a message that arrived while you were doing something else entirely. Now imagine living your entire life without that. Imagine that the time between something happening and you learning about it was measured not in minutes or hours but in weeks, sometimes months. Sometimes, in the most extreme cases, never, because the information simply never reached you. That was not an exceptional situation in human history. That was the ordinary state of affairs for virtually everyone who ever lived before the mid-19th century. And what that actually meant in daily life, in relationships, in commerce, in the way whole nations functioned, is more profound than most of us have ever stopped to consider. Let us begin with something as simple as sending a letter. Before the reforms of the 1840s, sending a letter in Britain was a transaction of remarkable complexity. The cost was not fixed. It varied by distance. It varied by the number of sheets of paper inside. And here is the part that, whenever I explain it to people, produces the most surprised reactions. The cost was usually paid not by the person who sent the letter, but by the person who received it. You sent a letter to someone you loved who lived 3 towns away. They paid to receive it, and here is the consequence of that arrangement: they could refuse. If you could not afford to pay the postman, you simply said no. The letter was returned. The communication never happened. For working-class families in which any family member had moved away to find work, which was increasingly common. As the Industrial Revolution drew people into cities, this meant that leaving home could mean losing touch entirely with the people you had left behind. Sending a letter cost at its most expensive roughly a day's wage for a working-class person. A day's wage for a single letter. In this environment, people developed extraordinary workarounds. One of them was cross-writing. Cross-writing involved writing a letter in the normal horizontal direction, then rotating the paper 90 degrees and writing over the same page in the vertical direction, creating a dense crisscross of text that could be decoded by a patient reader. The purpose was simple. Postage was charged partly by the number of sheets. If you could fit twice the words on one sheet, you paid for one sheet. Your correspondent had to work a little harder to read it, but you saved half the postage. Anyone who has read Jane Austen will recognize her letters, and the letters in her novels are full of characters managing exactly this kind of calculation. The way people wrote was shaped by the cost of sending. The man who changed all of this was a schoolteacher named Rowland Hill, who in 1837 published a pamphlet challenging the entire logic of the existing postal system. Hill's insight was elegant. He argued that the actual cost of transporting a letter, the physical act of moving it from one place to another, was almost entirely unrelated to the distance it travelled. Almost all the expense came at the two ends: collecting the letter, sorting it, delivering it. The miles in between were comparatively cheap. So why was the system charging based on distance? He proposed something radical: a flat rate. 1 penny for any letter going anywhere within Britain, paid by the sender in advance. The mechanism for proving advance payment would be a small adhesive piece of paper fixed to the letter, what Hill described as a bit of paper just large enough to bear the stamp and covered at the back with a glutinous wash. The world's first postage stamp, the penny black, issued on May 6, 1840, bearing an engraved profile of the young Queen Victoria. Simple, elegant, transformative. In the first year alone, the number of letters sent in Britain doubled. Within 10 years, it doubled again. Within a few decades, the principle of the prepaid postage stamp had spread to postal systems across the world, and the cost of communicating by letter had become, for the first time in history, genuinely accessible to ordinary people. But I want to linger for a moment on what communication actually looked like before Rowland Hill, and before the telegraph and before the newspaper, because I think we genuinely underestimate how different the world felt. Consider this. In June of 1815, one of the most consequential battles in European history was fought on a field near the Belgian village of Waterloo. Napoleon Bonaparte, who had dominated European politics for over a decade, was defeated by the combined forces of the Duke of Wellington and the Prussian army under Field Marshal Blücher. The outcome of this battle would reshape the map of Europe, determine the fate of empires, and settle decades of war, and news of it travelled to London by courier, on horseback. The battle was fought on June the 18th. The Duke of Wellington's official dispatch arrived in London on June the 21st. 3 days later, 3 days for the most important news on earth to travel roughly 250 miles. A banker named Nathan Mayer Rothschild, who had built his own private intelligence network specifically to stay ahead of official communications, received the news a full 48 hours before the government's own messengers arrived at Downing Street. He knew the war was over before the government did. That gap, 48 hours, was considered a remarkable competitive advantage, and it was obtained by having faster horses and more reliable couriers than the official system, not by technology, by horses. Now think about what this meant for ordinary people. Not bankers with private courier networks, not generals with dispatch riders, ordinary people. If you had a relative living in another country, a brother who had emigrated to the Americas, a daughter who had married and moved to a distant city, news travelled at the speed of a ship or a horse. A letter sent from London to someone in colonial Massachusetts in the 17th century took weeks at minimum. News of a death, a birth, a marriage, a war, all of it arrived on a delay so long that events had already unfolded, resolved and moved into history by the time the news of them reached you. You could learn that someone had died months after they were buried. You could send congratulations on a birth to a child who had already celebrated a birthday. You could receive an urgent warning about a danger that had already passed. Time for the pre-industrial person was not a synchronized shared experience the way it is for us. It was local. Where you stood was when it was. The rest of the world existed in a kind of informational fog, and the news that did reach you was not necessarily reliable. Before the organized press, before the telegraph, before any centralized mechanism for verifying what had happened, and distributing accurate information, rumors moved far faster than facts. A letter from a merchant in another city might contain news of a battle, a shipwreck, a royal death. But that merchant had heard it from someone else, who heard it from a traveller, who had it from someone who claimed to have been there. The chain of transmission was long. Every link introduced the possibility of error, exaggeration, or invention. Entire communities made decisions whether to plant, whether to travel, whether to send ships, whether to prepare for war based on information that might be weeks old, partially wrong, or entirely fabricated. This was not paranoia. This was simply the operating environment. There is something about the arrival of information in this world that I find genuinely moving, and I am not sure I can fully explain why. But I think it is this. When news travelled slowly, when a letter took weeks, and cost a day's wage to receive, the act of communication carried a weight it has largely lost. A letter was evidence that someone had chosen to spend time and money to reach across distance and touch your life. The delay between sending and receiving created a kind of suspended anticipation that we no longer have. The wait was part of the experience, and when word finally arrived, when the messenger knocked, when the letter was handed over, The moment of opening it was charged with something that instantaneous communication cannot replicate. This is not to say that slow news was better. It was categorically objectively worse in almost every practical dimension. People made decisions on bad information. Families were separated without the means to reach each other. Merchants lost fortunes because news arrived too late. But there was in that slowness a kind of weight to each word, a gravity, because every sentence had cost something to send. Here is something worth pausing on. We can now send a message to anyone on Earth in seconds for free. Billions of people carry devices that allow instant communication as a baseline, unremarkable feature of daily life. And yet studies consistently find that people today feel less informed, less connected, and more anxious about what they might be missing than at almost any other point in modern history. We receive 1,000 times more information than our great-grandparents, and we often feel we understand less. I'm not drawing a simple nostalgic conclusion from this. The telegraph was a miracle. The postal system was a miracle. The internet is a miracle. But what the history of communication teaches us is that the problem of information, of knowing what is true, of reaching the people who matter, of making sense of what is happening in the world has always been with us. It just used to show up as too little. Now it shows up as too much. What strikes me most, looking at all of this, the slow letters, the expensive postage, the delayed news, the cross-writing and the couriers, and the 48-hour gaps, is the sheer determination underneath it all. People wrote letters they were not sure would arrive. People paid postage they could barely afford. People built entire private courier networks in the hope of knowing something sooner, because connection mattered, because information mattered. Because even across enormous distances, even through enormous delays, people refused to accept that the gap between them and the people they cared about was simply uncrossable. That impulse to reach, to communicate, to close the distance is as old as language itself. The technologies around it have changed beyond recognition. The impulse has not. And on that note, the note of what humans will endure in order to stay connected, to feel informed, to understand the world they are living in, we arrive at the last full stop on our journey tonight. Because after everything we have explored, after all the discomfort and the darkness and the cold and the noise and the slow letters and the uncertain food, there is one more question sitting quietly at the end of all of it, the one that connects every part of this story. How did people bear it? Not just survive, but bear it. With enough grace and enough ingenuity and enough stubborn human persistence to build the world that we in turn inherited. The answer is more interesting than you might expect. And it brings us at last to the place where every good story eventually arrives. The end and what it means. We have spent this entire journey cataloguing discomfort. The smells, the bugs, the darkness, the shared beds, the uncertain food, the aching bodies, the frozen rooms, the filthy streets, the slow letters. And somewhere along the way a question has probably been forming in the back of your mind. Not, how did people survive all this? Because survival is relatively straightforward even under difficult conditions. But something more specific, something more personal. How did they bear it with enough grace to also do everything else? To write poetry and build cathedrals and raise children and fall in love and make music and argue philosophy and invent things and keep going? How did a person crawling with lice in a cold, drafty house with a toothache, with no reliable news from the outside world, with ink freezing on the desk and waste running through the street below the window, how did that person also manage to be in some deep and irreducible sense human? The answer, I think, is both simpler and more interesting than you might expect. And it starts with something that might surprise you. It starts with the lice. The powdered wig. If you have ever seen a portrait of an 18th century nobleman, that enormous, towering, elaborately curled mountain of white hair, and wondered what on earth was going on here is the full story. It began as so many things in history do with the disease, specifically syphilis. By the 17th century, syphilis had been spreading through European populations for over a century, one of its visible symptoms, and this was particularly devastating for men in a culture that equated flowing hair with power, health and virility, was patchy progressive hair loss. King Louis XIII of France, who ruled from 1610 to 1643, began losing his hair prematurely. He started wearing a wig. His courtiers, with the eager conformity that courts have always displayed toward whatever the king does, immediately followed. Within years, wigs were fashionable across the French nobility, and since France set the tone for European fashion in the 17th century, they spread rapidly across the continent. By the time Louis XIV, the Sun King, was on the throne, wigs were no longer a practical accommodation. They were an art form. Louis XIV employed 40 wig makers, not one, 40. His wigmaker, Georges Binet, was reported to have declared that he would strip the hair from every subject in France if necessary to cover the king's head properly. One of Louis XIV's great wigs required up to 10 heads of human hair to construct, but here is the part that turns this whole extravagant story sideways. The wig was not just fashion, it was in a completely accidental way also a public health measure. Because head lice, which we have already established, were a nearly universal companion of human life in the medieval and early modern world, were genuinely difficult and unpleasant to manage in natural hair. A wig changed the equation entirely. To wear a wig properly, you shaved your head first, and a shaved head gave lice nowhere to live. Meanwhile, the wig itself, when it inevitably became infested because lice went wherever human hair was, whether it was attached to a head or not, could simply be sent to the wig maker, who would boil it, which killed the lice. Problem managed. No painful nitpicking, no hours of tedious grooming. Just send the wig to the shop, collect it clean, go about your day. The wig as lice management system was not why the wig became fashionable. But once it was fashionable, this practical benefit helped it stay fashionable for well over a century. And by the mid-18th century in Paris alone, the number of wig makers had grown from around 200 in 1673 to over 800 in 1765. 800 wig makers in one city, all employed essentially to help people deal with the same small persistent creatures that had been sharing human hair since the beginning of recorded time. This is a pattern that runs through the entire history of human discomfort. Not surrender, not resignation, workaround. Creative, sometimes absurd, often ingenious workaround. The wig was a workaround for lice. The chopine was a workaround for filthy streets. The pomander was a workaround for urban smells. The crossed writing letter was a workaround for expensive postage. The frost fair was a workaround for a frozen river. Everywhere you look in this history, at every level of society, what you find is not people passively enduring, but people actively, relentlessly, sometimes brilliantly working around whatever inconvenience the world had placed in front of them. And when the workaround was not available, when the lice could not be managed, the cold could not be escaped, the pain could not be relieved, the letter would not arrive, then people did something else entirely. They made it a festival. This is perhaps the most profound coping mechanism in all of human history, and it is one we have almost entirely overlooked in our journey tonight. The deliberate, ritualized, socially sanctioned inversion of everything that was hard. Consider Saturnalia. Every December, from at least the 3rd century before the Common Era until the decline of the Roman Empire, the city of Rome did something extraordinary for 7 days. It turned itself upside down. Masters served their enslaved people at table. Enslaved people were allowed to speak freely, to gamble, to wear the clothing of free citizens. The rigid social hierarchy that governed every other day of the year was suspended by collective agreement for 1 week. There was a designated king of Saturnalia chosen by lot from the household, usually someone of a lower rank whose absurd, often outrageous commands had to be obeyed. The Roman poet Catullus called the festival the best of days. Pliny the Younger, who apparently found the noise somewhat much, retreated to his room while the rest of the household celebrated. Seneca complained that the whole mob has let itself go in pleasures. These are not the descriptions of a reluctant ritual. This was the most eagerly anticipated holiday of the Roman year, and its energy was not random. It was deliberately designed, as the historian and author Macrobius noted the inversion. The temporary equality, the licensed disorder, was understood as a ritual reenactment of the mythic Golden Age, when all people lived without hierarchy, without suffering, without the grinding daily inequalities of ordinary life. For 7 days a year Rome pretended together and openly that the world was better than it was. And then it went back to normal, because everyone understood that the holiday would end. That was the point. The release was real precisely because the limits were real. The medieval world inherited this impulse and made it its own. The Feast of Fools, celebrated around the 1st of January across much of Europe during the Middle Ages, was Saturnalia with clerical robes. Junior clergy assumed the positions of their superiors. Elaborate parodies of the Church's own rituals were performed. The dignified solemnity of ecclesiastical authority was mocked gently by the very people over whom it held power. Bishops' robes were worn by choir boys. False popes were elected. Church officials wore masks or dressed in women's clothing. The medieval Lord of Misrule, elected at Christmas to preside over 12 days of controlled chaos, issued commands that range from the merely surprising to the genuinely outrageous. And the Church itself, though it tried repeatedly to ban these practices and sometimes succeeded, for a time ultimately could not extinguish them, because they were meeting a need so fundamental that suppressing them in one form only caused them to resurface in another. That need was this. People living in difficult conditions need periodically to look their difficulty in the face and laugh at it, not to deny it, not to pretend it is not there, but to name it, to perform it, to turn it theatrical, and in doing so to assert something that all the difficulty in the world cannot take away. The fact that you are still here, that you can still laugh, that the world is hard and you know it and it has not finished you yet. Can I ask you something personal for a moment? Think about the last time something was genuinely difficult, not catastrophic, just the grinding daily kind of difficult. Exhaustion, frustration, the kind of low-level discomfort that does not have a name but sits on you like weight. What did you do? Most of us, I suspect, did not do it alone. We called someone, we went somewhere, we gathered. Maybe we complained, which is its own kind of saturnalia, the ritual naming of hardship, the collective acknowledgement that it is real. Maybe we laughed. Maybe we ate something good. Maybe we just sat with people who understood. That gathering impulse, that movement toward connection when things are hard, is as old as our species. It predates writing. It predates cities. It is in us before we know how to name it. And the festivals were simply the organized, institutionalized, socially endorsed version of exactly this. There is one more thing I want to say about the people who lived through everything we've explored tonight. Something that took me a long time to articulate properly. We tend to assume that hardship, when it is constant enough, when it is simply the texture of every day, produces a kind of deadening, a blunting of sensitivity, a stoicism that is really just numbness. But the historical evidence does not support this. The louse picking on the rooftop in Montaigu was also gossip, community. The roasting of an ox on the frozen Thames in 1684 was also a party. The powdering of a wig in 17th century Paris was also a social ritual and art form, a statement about identity and culture. The cross-written letter with its careful, dense lines filling every corner of the page was also, and I believe this deeply evidence of how much someone had to say, how much they wanted to reach across the distance, how much they cared. Hardship did not blunt these people. It gave them things to solve, and in solving them they built the world we inherited. The wigs eventually went out of fashion. The Feast of Fools was eventually abolished. The frost fairs on the Thames ended when a new bridge was built that kept the river flowing too fast to freeze. The lice were gradually imperfectly, incompletely managed by soap and sanitation and scientific understanding. Every annoyance we have explored tonight was eventually addressed. Not all at once, not cleanly, not without enormous effort and sometimes enormous suffering along the way, but addressed, because that is what people do. They see a problem, they build a workaround, they throw a festival, they write a letter, they shave their head and put on a wig, they laugh, and they keep going. And now we arrive at the last stop on our journey tonight, the place where all of this leads. We have looked at where people were, we have looked at what they endured, we have looked at how they bore it. Now in our final chapter we turn around and look at where we are, because the most interesting question in all of this is not what life was like for them. It is what their lives and their endurance and their workarounds and their festivals, what all of it means for us right now, tonight, in a world that has solved almost everything they struggled with, and yet still manages to find things to struggle with. We have arrived at last at the end, and I want to begin this final chapter the same way we began the whole journey tonight, with you, right here, right now, wherever you are listening to this. There is a bed beneath you, or a couch, or a chair. The room is warm or warm enough. The air you are breathing does not smell of the street outside. Something somewhere in your home is quietly managing the temperature. There is light available to you if you want it at the touch of a button. If you are thirsty, clean water is within reach. If something hurts, there is medicine in a drawer somewhere. If you want to know what is happening in the world, you could find out in seconds. And you are, I hope, not too uncomfortable, not too cold, not too hungry, not too afraid of what the night might bring. Sit with all of that for just a moment. Because everything I have just described, every single item on that list, was for the overwhelming majority of human history not guaranteed. Most of it was not possible. Much of it was not even imaginable. Here is a number I want you to hold in your mind. In 1800, less than 300 years ago, in a world that already had universities and symphonies and great works of literature and magnificent architecture, the average human life expectancy across the world was approximately 35 years. 35, not because of war or famine in any particular year, but because infection, poor sanitation, untreated disease, childbirth complications, and the accumulated weight of daily hardship simply ended lives at a rate we cannot fully comprehend from where we stand today. A child born in 1800 had roughly a 1 in 3 chance of not reaching the age of 5. 1 in 3. Not in a war zone, not in the most impoverished corner of the world. On average, across the globe, by 2024, average global life expectancy had reached roughly 73 years. We've added nearly 40 years of human life on average in less than 2 centuries. That is not a small thing. That is arguably the most profound change in human experience in the entire history of our species. And the vast majority of that change came not from any single dramatic discovery, but from exactly the kinds of things we've been talking about tonight. Cleaner streets, indoor plumbing, food safety, reliable warmth in winter, the ability to communicate with doctors to receive information to act on it quickly, the quiet, unglamorous infrastructure of not dying from something preventable. And yet, here is the question I've been circling all night, and I want to ask it directly now. Why is it that we living in this extraordinary moment with more comfort and more safety and more access to everything than any human beings who ever lived before us still spend so much of our time feeling frustrated, overwhelmed, and dissatisfied? Why does a slow internet connection feel like an emergency when our great-grandparents could not reliably get a letter across a country? Why does a bad night's sleep feel catastrophic when for millennia humans slept in 2 segments on straw, beside strangers in rooms that never fully warmed? Why do minor inconveniences feel so significant when the threshold for what previous generations considered a reasonable day was so much higher than anything we routinely experience? I do not ask this as a criticism. I ask it because I think the answer is genuinely interesting, and I think the history we have explored tonight actually provides it. The answer as best I can understand it is this: human beings do not experience life against the backdrop of history. We experience it against the backdrop of our expectations, and our expectations adjust almost immediately to whatever becomes normal. The person who shaved their head and put on a wig in 1680 had genuinely solved a lice problem that had plagued them for years. But within a generation, the wig was simply normal, and the new annoyance was the wig itself, that it was heavy, that it needed maintenance, that it marked your social position in ways that constrained you. The woman who watched her city get its first sewer system in the 1870s probably felt the same way we feel when the internet finally reaches a fast enough speed to stream video without buffering. Relief, gratitude, and then very quickly an assumption that this is simply how things should be. And then when it fails, when the sewer backs up, when the buffering returns, the same frustration that would have made no sense to her grandmother, who simply threw the chamber pot out the window. This is not weakness. This is how humans are built. We adapt. We adjust our baseline. We discover new frontiers of what we want. The medieval peasant was not unhappy because they lacked a smartphone. They were, as far as historical evidence suggests, as capable of joy and grief and love and boredom as we are. They just had different things to contend with. And in 100 years, possibly much less, people will look back at our lives and feel the same mixture of astonishment and compassion that we feel looking back at theirs. What will they think that is genuinely worth wondering about? They may look at our relationship with information, the flood of it, the noise, the difficulty of knowing what is true, and find it as bewildering as we find the thought of receiving news of a battle 3 days after it happened. They may look at our medical situation and be staggered that we still endured significant pain, that treatments for major diseases were still uncertain, that the body could betray us in ways we'd not learned to prevent. They may be amazed that we drove ourselves in metal boxes at high speeds on roads and that we found this normal and acceptable. They will certainly have their own annoyances that we cannot currently imagine. Because every solved problem creates the conditions for a new one. That is not pessimism. It is the shape of history. Every generation lives at the edge of what is possible and finds that edge just barely unsatisfying enough to push further. And here is what I find most moving about the whole long story we have told tonight. Not the discomfort, not the ingenuity, not even the festivals and the workarounds and the stubborn human insistence on continuing. But this, every improvement in human life, every single one we have talked about tonight, was made by someone who thought things could be better, not someone who accepted the chamber pot out the window as inevitable, not someone who said, well, we have always frozen the ink in winter, what can you do? Not someone who decided that pain simply had to be endured, that the streets simply had to be filthy, that letters simply had to be expensive, that lice simply had to be managed. Someone who looked at the difficulty and said, "This is not acceptable. We can do better," and then did. Joseph Bazalgette looking at the sewage-choked Thames and building 1,000 miles of underground brick tunnels that the city still relies on today. Rowland Hill calculating that postage made no sense the way it was charged, and proposing a small adhesive stamp that became the template for postal systems across the entire world. The unnamed Italian glassmaker around 1284 who figured out that curved glass could correct failing vision, and described it to Fra Giordano, who stood in a church in Pisa and declared it one of the best and most necessary arts in the world. The unnamed peasant woman somewhere in medieval France, who looked at the rushlight burning for 20 minutes and invited her neighbours over to share the light and do their mending together. Not resigned, not defeated, just practical and connected. The thing I want you to take from tonight, if you take only one thing, is this. The comfort you're lying in right now is the accumulated workaround of 10,000 generations of human beings who found something intolerable and refused to leave it that way. The clean water, the warm room, the medicine in the drawer, the bed you are sleeping in with left and right shoes beside it. All of it, chosen for, fought for, figured out, by people who lived in circumstances we would find genuinely staggering, who nevertheless got up every day and worked towards something better. Not for themselves most of the time, for people they would never meet, for us. So the next time the Wi-Fi is slow or the coffee is wrong or something is mildly unremarkably inconvenient, I hope you remember just for a moment the woman with the rushlight and the 20 minutes, and the neighbours gathered close, the man warming his ink before he could write, the child sleeping on top of the stove, the crossing sweeper with his broom in the filthy street, the widow leaving her son a red and green bed canopy in her will, the printer setting up his press on the frozen Thames, all of them living fully in conditions we cannot quite imagine, and not one of them, as far as history tells us, sitting still. Thank you. From the bottom of my heart, thank you for spending your night here with me, for lying in the dark and letting this strange, imperfect, extraordinarily human story wash over you. These stories matter, not because they make us feel guilty about our comfort, but because they remind us what comfort is actually made of, what it costs, what it means, and what we might owe quietly and daily to the people who built the floor we stand on. Sleep well tonight. You are resting in the work of 10,000 years, and when you wake up, when you reach for the light, when the water runs hot, when the day begins, I hope some small part of you carries this with you, that everything ordinary around you was once to someone extraordinary, and will be again. If this journey tonight has meant something to you, I would love to hear about it. Leave a comment below what surprised you most, what stayed with you. And if you want more stories like this, the ones that make the ordinary strange and the strange suddenly familiar, make sure you subscribe, because the next journey is already waiting, and I promise you, wherever we go next, you will never look at the world quite the same way again. Good night, friend.